Section 18 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ron Altman. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. Oppositions of Science. Part 4. The lesson taught as to the right use of Scripture by the astronomical difficulty received new application and accentuation in the controversy that arose in last century as to the bearing on the biblical account of the creation of the discoveries of geology. The law applies here also that the Bible is not designed to anticipate the discoveries of 19th century science, but speaks of natural things as they lie open to the eye of the ordinary observer, and uses the language that would be understood by readers of its own time. Genesis 1 says, God created, but leaves it open to any subsequent discovery to show the method of his creation. This Genesis record is utterly unlike any other cosmogony that ever was given. Its inspiration is attested by its monotheistic character, its sublimity of thought and style, and its truth of representation in essential points. Comparison with the debased polytheistic creation legend of Babylonia only brings out more forcibly the unchallengeable superiority of the biblical account. Its intention is primarily to be the vehicle of the great religious ideas that inform it, yet so true is the insight yielded by the spirit of revelation that the writer or seer is able really to seize the great stadia in the process of creation, and to represent these in a way which conveys a practically accurate conception of them to men's minds. Proof of this is hardly needed when we have a certificate to the fact from no less redoubtable an authority than Haeckel himself. He speaks of, quote, the simple and natural chain of ideas which runs through, unquote, the Mosaic account, emphasizes how, quote, two great and fundamental ideas, common also to the non-miraculous theory of development, meet us in the Mosaic hypothesis of creation with surprising clearness and simplicity. The idea of separation or differentiation, and the idea of progressive development, or perfecting, unquote, and bestows his, quote, just and sincere admiration on the Jewish lawgiver's grand insight into nature, and his simple and natural hypothesis of creation, unquote. The tribute thus paid is just. I do not touch on the harmonies of Genesis and geology, but only ask the reader to consider if it would have been possible to construct such parallels as we have, for instance, in Hugh Miller's Testimony of the Rocks, had there not been at least very remarkable general resemblances to go upon. To my own mind, the general harmony does seem very striking. I quote again words of my own, quote, the dark watery waste over which the Spirit broods with vivifying power, the advent of light, the formation of an atmosphere or sky capable of sustaining the clouds above it, the settling of the great outlines of the continents and seas, the clothing of the dry land with abundant vegetation, the adjustment of the earth's relation to sun and moon as the visible rulers of its day and night, the production of the great sea monsters, and reptile-like creatures and birds, the peopling of the earth with four-footed beasts and cattle, last of all the advent of man. Is there so much of all this which science requires us to cancel?" Unquote. Even with regard to the days, the duration of time involved, there is no insuperable difficulty. The writer may very well have intended symbolically or pictorially to represent the creation as a great week of work, ending with the Creator's Sabbath rest. It seems to me, however, more probable, in view of the fact that days of 24 hours do not begin to run till the appointment of the sun on the fourth day, Genesis 1, verse 14, that he did not intend to affix a precise length to his creation days. These, therefore, may be allowed to represent long periods of duration. This view is taken on exegetical grounds alone by Christian writers long before geology was heard of. Footnote. For example, by Augustine, De Civitate Dei 11, verse 6-7, quote, "Of what fashion these days were, it is exceedingly hard, or altogether impossible to think, much more to speak," unquote, and etc. End of footnote. But suppose it granted that the difficulty is largely past in regard to the age of the earth. Is there not still a serious obstacle to the acceptance of the Bible's teaching in the declarations of science on the extreme antiquity of man? If man's appearance on the earth is to be carried back 100,000 or 200,000 years, or even farther, how does this fit in with the Bible's account of his creation, apparently some 6,000 years ago? A preliminary inquiry would be, is it clear that man's existence needs to be carried back so far? I prefer, however, to look at the matter first on its biblical side. I leave to those who care for them speculations on pre-Adamic man and the like, and accept for myself what I take to be the plain teaching of Scripture, that man made in God's image was the last of the Creator's works, Genesis 1, 26 and 27, and that the whole race of human beings has sprung from Adam, the first created man, Genesis 3, verse 20. How is the date usually assigned to this event to be reconciled with the alleged facts of anthropology? The honest answer to this question must be, it cannot be reconciled. Apart from anthropology altogether, the course of discovery in Babylonia and Egypt has been such as to show that man existed on the earth in a state of civilization many millenniums earlier than was formerly believed. The Bible itself, however, is not thereby discredited, but only the human chronologies based on it, as it has been proved mistakenly. The Bible gives, indeed, summaries of early human history and genealogical tables extending in apparently unbroken line from Adam to Abraham and Moses. But just here the fallacy comes in. For setting mythical explanations aside, who is to guarantee that these genealogies are or were ever intended to be complete, or that they do not in some cases represent heads of families or clan fathers, or typical links in a long chain of descent, the intermediate links of which are dropped out? The highly technical manner in which genealogies were commonly constructed, compare the list of the 70 who went down with Jacob to Egypt, Genesis 46, which, with other anomalies, includes Jacob himself and the 2 sons of Joseph born in Egypt, verse 20 in the number. The frequent mingling of clan or tribal names with personal, as obviously in Genesis 10 and 11, the compression of lists by omission of names, as in Christ's genealogy in Matthew 1, where 3 names are omitted between Joram and Uzziah, verse 8, show conclusively that it is impossible to use such genealogies as we have in Genesis 5 and 11 as a basis for accurate chronological reckoning. So obvious is this on reflection that the most conservative biblical students seem now agreed that the early genealogies must be interpreted with great latitude, and that nothing stands in the way of a large extension of the period of man's existence on the earth, if such should prove to be required. It does not follow, however, that the extravagant claims put forth in certain scientific quarters for man's antiquity are offhand to be accepted. There are the best reasons for not accepting them. The older estimates of geological time generally have had to be enormously retrenched, and one by one the criteria relied on to prove man's extreme antiquity have been shown not to be reliable. The assumption of tertiary, even of Miocene or Pliocene, man may, in the present state of the evidence, be dismissed from consideration. The question of man's age now resolves itself pretty much into that of man's relation to the glacial period, pre-glacial, interglacial, post-glacial, and on this experts are far from agreed. 2 things seem to myself fairly well ascertained. First, that the earliest certain traces of man are towards the close of the glacial period, and second, that the close of this period, and with it the advent of man, are much more recent than was some time ago imagined. There seems good and constantly accumulating evidence that, in America at least, the conditions in Europe were probably not widely dissimilar, the glacial age closed not more than from 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. This brings the age of man within quite reasonable limits. The evidence on these points, so far as I know it, I have set forth in a recent book, and I need not here repeat it. I only observe, in illustration of the first, that in the latest book I have seen on the subject, that on North America, by I.C. Russell, Professor of Geology in the University of Michigan, 1904, it is very confidently stated that, quote, "We find no authentic and well-attested evidence of the presence of man in America, either previous to or during the glacial period. All the geological evidence thus far gathered bearing on the antiquity of man in America points to the conclusion that he came after the glacial epoch." Unquote. Page 362. The case does not seem to be very different in England, and probably is not on the continent of Europe either. In this connection many authorities, as Prestwick, Howarth, the late Duke of Argyll, Dawson, G.F. Wright, etc., think that geology proves an extensive post-glacial submergence after the advent of man, which they relate with the Noachian deluge. Sir Henry Howarth says, quote, "I do not see how the historian, the archaeologist, and the paleontologist can avoid making this conclusion in future a prime factor in their discussions, and I venture to think that before long it will be accepted as unanswerable." Unquote. Part 5. What now, finally, is to be said of the brute origin of man? Has evolution not demonstrated that man is a slow development from the ape? Footnote. Haeckel writes, quote, I have given fully in my history of creation the weighty reasons for claiming this descent of man from the anthropoid apes, unquote. Quoting again, it is therefore established beyond question for all impartial scientific inquiry that the human race comes directly from the apes of the Old World, unquote. Quoting again, the resistance to the theory of a descent from the apes is clearly due in most cases to feeling rather than to reason, unquote. Evolution of Man, Popular Edition, pages 264 and 352. End of footnote. That his original condition was one of unrelieved animalism, and that his first appearance on earth must be put back countless ages, perhaps to Eocene times, to allow of his making the advances he has done. If so, what becomes of his being made in the image of God, as Scripture affirms, and of his fall from innocence in Eden? If his primitive condition was not one of innocent simplicity, what becomes of the whole Scripture doctrine of sin? These are grave questions, but I believe that without contravening any established scientific facts, a satisfactory answer can be given to them. There is no need for challenging the general doctrine of evolution, supported as that is by many evidences. But as every scientific man knows, evolution and the Darwinian theory of evolution are very distinct things. The former may be accepted and the latter rejected. Darwinism is, in fact, at the present moment, being largely superseded by a type of evolution of a quite different stamp. This newer evolution, as it is sometimes called, denies the sufficiency of the Darwinian theory of natural selection acting on fortuitous variations, seeks the causes of organic development chiefly within the organism, affirms purpose and design, above all, challenges the view that new species originate by slow and insensible variations out of others, and lays the stress on sudden changes, abrupt mutations, the rapid breaking up of existing types, and appearance of new and higher forms. Professor Foster, in his book already frequently quoted, gives some account of it, as I myself had done in my book on God's image in man, and goes so far as to say that, quote, it sets aside Darwinism as an overcome hypothesis, unquote, page 235. Footnote. I have pointed out that Professor Foster owes much to Rudolf Otto, whose papers on the subject I frequently refer to in the notes to my own book. These able papers are now republished in the volume previously alluded to. Compare E.T. chapters 4 to 7. End of footnote. It is obvious that if this new theory of saltatory or mutational evolution is accepted, it does away at a stroke with nearly all the difficulties connected with the origin of man. It involves a revolution in the way of conceiving the evolutionary process at once as regards the time required, the nature of the forces employed, and the need of supposing minute gradations between the lower and higher forms. In man's case, there is no longer need for supposing a slow and gradual ascent from ape to true man. The leap, when the proper time comes, may be taken with all the suddenness needed to introduce the new being, with his distinctive attributes, upon the scene. Neither is there any need for picturing man, on his first appearance, as a semi-animal, the subject of brute impulse and unregulated passion. His nature may have been internally harmonious, with possibilities of sinless development, which only his own free act annulled. Room is given on this view for a doctrine of sin, both individual and racial, such as Scripture affirms and requires as the basis of its doctrine of redemption, and as experience so abundantly ratifies. In corroboration of the view now presented of the origin of man, and in opposition to the Darwinian and Haeckellian theories of the descent of man, two all-important facts may be briefly adverted to. The first is the continued absence of all real middle links between man and his hypothetical ape ancestor. The Miocene Dryopithecus is now generally given up, and hope is chiefly rested on the remains of the supposed ape-man, Pithecanthropus erectus, roof of a skull, some teeth, a thigh bone, discovered in 1892-94 by Dubois, a Dutch doctor in Java. But scientific opinion steadily tends to the rejection of this also, as a true intermediate form. At an anthropological congress held at Lindau in September 1899, Dr. Buhmüller read a paper in which he declared that the supposed Pithecanthropus is nothing but a gibbon, as Virchow surmised from the first. Last year, an eminent anatomist, Professor J. Coleman of Basel, contributed to a scientific magazine, Globus, an elaborate article on the descent of man. In this, he discusses the Java specimen and rejects it as a middle link between man and the apes. Footnote: he adheres to the view he expressed at a Berlin Congress that the Javan specimen is indeed a highly interesting ape of the great group of the anthropoids, but cannot be regarded as a transitional form to man. An account of this article was given in the Westminster Gazette for August 30, 1906. I quote from the article itself. End of footnote. More than this, he holds and argues for the view that man's line of descent is not through the larger anthropoid apes at all. Some anthropologists contend not through apes of any kind. Of course, if this is true, the whole question falls to the ground. The second fact is that the oldest skulls yet discovered do not afford support to the theory of the slow ascent of man from the ape. Some of them, as the Engis and Cro-Magnon skulls, are of excellent brain capacity. Others, as the Neanderthal, Kronstadt, and Spee skulls, are more degraded. A recent discovery, 1900, of a skull of a diluvial man in Krapina in Croatia of the Neanderthal type, with differences, adds interest to the problem. All these skulls are truly human and can be paralleled by existing races. Huxley, in his work on Man's Place in Nature, in 1879, affirmed of the Neanderthal skull that it could in no sense be regarded as intermediate between man and the ape, and in an article in the 19th Century, 1900, pages 750 and following, he reaffirms with slight qualifications his former verdicts. He endorses the words of M. Freypont, quote, "Between the man of Spee and an existing anthropoid ape, there lies an abyss." Unquote. Professor Coleman is of opinion that the better-formed skulls are the older. I would only add that so far as history has any voice in this matter, it does not confirm the idea of a gradual ascent of man from lowest barbarism. The further we push back the ancient civilizations, we find still true man in all the plenitude of his powers, and possessed of arts, cities, culture, and religion. On the whole, therefore, we may still affirm without mistrust the old genealogy which alone answers to the facts of man's nature. Quote, "The son of Adam, the son of God." Unquote. Luke 3, verse 38. Part 6. To this discussion of the general relation of religion to the sciences, I may in conclusion append a few words on the objection sometimes raised to the Gospels, in the name of science, on the subject of demon possession. Professor Huxley, who may speak for all, puts the matter in his usual strong way thus, quote, "If Jesus taught the demonological system involved in the Gadarene story, if a belief in that system formed a part of the spiritual convictions in which he lived and died, then I, for my part, unhesitatingly refuse belief in that teaching and deny the reality of those spiritual convictions." Unquote. In strictness, as indeed Professor Huxley occasionally admits, the question is not one of science at all. Footnote. He repeatedly declares in the course of his discussion with Dr. Wassi that he has, quote, "no a priori objection to offer," unquote, that, quote, "for anything I can prove to the contrary, there may be spiritual beings capable of the same transmigration," unquote, that he is, quote, "unable to show cause why these transferable devils should not exist," unquote. Essays on Agnosticism, etc. End of footnote. For the existence and operation of a spiritual kingdom of evil lies beyond the province of a science of nature altogether. On the point of fact, however, many feel as Professor Huxley did on demoniacal possession, and resort to theories of accommodation, or to kenotic views of the limitations of our Lord's human knowledge to get rid of the difficulty. It seems to me, on the other hand, that if Jesus stood in the spiritual rapport with the invisible world, which the Gospels declare he did, this is precisely one of the things on which it is impossible that he could be mistaken. It is granted that Jesus believed in an evil spiritual world, and in an evil one, who was its prince and ruler. I accept the belief on his authority, and because I think it not unreasonable in itself, and borne out by many facts in experience and history. I am not at all prepared to affirm that demoniacal possession in the strict sense does not yet exist. I believe that many things could be adduced to show that it does. I take the Gospels accordingly as they are on this point, without attempting to explain their testimony away. Footnote. The Reverend D. Smith, in his work, The Days of His Flesh, thinks that Jesus, quote, "knowing right well what the ailment was," unquote, further quote, dealt with the demoniacs after the manner of a wise physician. He did not seek to dispel their hallucination. He fell in with it and won their confidence, unquote, page 108. In the case of the Gadarene demoniac, Mr. Smith thinks that the Lord, humoring the man's delusion, quote, pressed the swine into the service of his humane endeavors. He smote the creatures with a sudden panic, and they rushed down the incline to their destruction. The stratagem was entirely successful, unquote. Page 193. To me, it seems easier to believe in the demons. End of footnote. It is reasonable to believe that the hour of, quote, the power of darkness, unquote, Luke 22, verse 53, would be marked by exceptional manifestations of this form of evil. It is not the case, besides, that, as sometimes said, all diseases were ascribed to demoniacal agency, though possession was usually accompanied by some form of disease. For example, Mark 9, verses 17 and following. Distinction is clearly made in the Gospels between ordinary sickness, disease, lunacy, and possession. Compare Matthew 4, verse 23 and 24, chapter 9, verses 32 to 35, and chapter 10, verse 8, etc. End of section 18.
Section 19 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chris Pyle. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. The Bible and Ethics, God and My Neighbor, Parts 1 through 3. The Bible is assailed on its ethical side. The attack has been continuous from the days of Celsus and the Gnostics in the 2nd century, down through the deists of the 18th century, to the philosophical, critical, and free-thinking schools of our own day. Sometimes there is a genuine zeal for morality in the accusations made. At other times, as in the coarser free-thinking organs, the attacks are wanton, ribald, and vulgar. The shapes which this assault upon the Bible assumes are protean. The character of Jehovah in the Old Testament is vehemently assaulted. The ancient Gnostics represented the God of the Old Testament as partial, passionate, vindictive, cruel, and many moderns reiterate the charge. Even a writer of the better order, like Dr. Ladd, does not hesitate in his recent book on the philosophy of religion to endorse the statement, "The black man of some shivering communistic savages is nearer the morality of our Lord than the Jehovah of Judges." Volume 1, page 226. If that be so, it need not be said that the Jehovah of Judges is no true God, and there is no meaning in speaking of revelation in connection with him. Much of the teaching in the Old Testament is denounced as barbarous. Its heroes are pilloried as unworthy and immoral. Footnote. Mr. Blatchford on the heroes of the Bible in his book God and My Neighbor. It seems strange to me, he says, that such men as Moses, David, and Solomon should be glorified by Christian men and women who execrate Henry VIII and Richard III as monsters. My pet aversion among the Bible heroes is Jacob, but Abraham and Lot were pitiful creatures. Is Lot a Bible hero? End footnote. The prophets are commonly allowed to have higher conceptions, but even they are held in many ways to have fallen short of perfect morality. Jesus himself, while generally an object of reverence, does not wholly escape censure. His ideals are thought to be visionary and unpractical. Extremists like Nietzsche go further and rave against him as the arch misleader of the race. His morality is a morality for slaves. Paul's doctrines are alleged to have an immoral tendency. The inferences which the apostle repudiated as blasphemy, "Let us do evil that good may come," Romans chapter 3, verse 8. "Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?" Romans chapter 6, verse 1. are held to be the true outcome of his teaching. All this seems very shocking, but it has to be dealt with. No one denies there are genuine moral difficulties in the Bible, as there are in the ordinary providence of God. But this is not the spirit in which to approach them. If there is one force that has wrought for the moral upbuilding of mankind more than another, every candid mind knows it is the Bible. It is not difficult to show that the greater number of these so-called difficulties, at any rate, are due to misconception and perversion, that much of the argument against the morality of the Bible is pure irrelevance, while if the Bible is regarded in the balance of its parts, in its true character as a progressive revelation, and in the total impression its teaching makes upon the mind, it is seen to be a book which, from its first page to its last, makes for righteousness, exalts holiness, condemns sin, aims at nothing so much as the complete conquest of evil in human hearts and subjugation of it throughout the universe. Part 1. I have said that many of the objections to the morality of the Bible arise from misconceptions and perversion. I need hardly stay to vindicate the character or religion of Jesus from Nietzsche's extravagances, or to show that the Bible is not committed to the approval of the sins it impartially narrates, even in the case of those who are called its heroes. What is to be said of the character and shortcomings of these will be seen after. But even those who have higher ideas of the morality of Israel make sometimes very indefensible statements. It is difficult to understand, e.g., how a writer like Dr. Buchanan Gray can permit himself to say, as he does in his Divine Discipline of Israel, that the Hebrews were bound by moral obligation and the sanction of religion in their dealings with one another, but were entirely free of these in their dealings with foreigners. Page 48. What grounds exist for such a statement? Who can read the early chapters of the Bible without seeing that it is constantly assumed that there are moral laws which bind Hebrews and heathens alike, and that the transgression of these is sin, which the judge of all earth, Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, must punish? Why else the judgment of the flood, Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, the destruction of the cities of the plain, Genesis chapter 18, verse 20, the rooting out of the Canaanites, Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 and following, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 29 and following. Had Abraham no sense of rights as between man in his transactions with the sons of Heth about a burying place, Genesis chapter 23, or Joseph in his behavior in the house of his master the Egyptian, Genesis chapter 39, verses 4 through 6 and 9. Even in the passage which Dr. Gray cites in support of his theme, Abraham's passing off his wife as his sister at Gerar, Abimelech reproaches Abraham, "Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done." Genesis chapter 20, verse 9. Many of the objections to the ethics of the Bible arise for ignoring the laws of progress and revelation, which in respect of morality is one that must certainly be recognized. It was as impossible in the 20th century before Christ, as it is in the 20th century after Christ, to introduce a ready-made system of morality, perfect in all its principles and applications, and carried out with full consistency in an ideal constitution of society. It may, in our eyes, be a drawback that society is constituted on the principle of historical evolution. And so it is, and even Revelation has to take account of the fact. I do not undervalue the amount of moral light which even the ancient world possessed. As the study of ancient religion shows, Babylonia, Egypt, that moral light was often very great. The world, as Paul affirms, had from the first a great deal more light, both religious and moral, than it knew well how to make use of. Romans chapter 1, verses 21, 25, and 28. Yet there is progress. One has only to compare the conceptions of these ancient times, even within the Bible, and with those of later periods, to see how much purer and more spiritual moral ideas had become in the days of the prophets, and how far even beyond the teaching of the prophets is the perfect spirituality of the law of love, as enunciated by Jesus Christ. Polygamy, slavery, marriage of near of kin, blood revenge, corporate responsibility, the unsparing use of the sword in war, were features of that old society into which revelation entered, and it was plainly impossible to abolish them at a stroke. Christianity itself, while inculcating principles which strike at the root of slavery, war, and many other evils, has even yet not been able to banish these evils wholly from society, though it is working steadily to that end. What then was possible at an earlier time but to take a single people out of the mass, or rather develop such a people from the individual and family, and starting, as was inevitable, at the stage the world then occupied, to train and discipline this selected people, under the guidance of special revelation, to something better for the ultimate benefit of the whole of mankind. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And as we know, this was actually the method adopted. When this principle of development in God's methods is grasped, the right perspective is obtained, and each stage and phase of revelation is judged of by itself in the light of its aim and outcome, instead of being unhistorically judged by the standards of a more perfect time, a law of judgment the moralist would apply to nothing else. It does not follow that all difficulties disappear, but we are now, at least, in the right position for dealing with them. It becomes apparent how, in the history of God's dealing with his people, many forces, for instance, the great religious ideas embodied in patriarchal and Mosaic revelations, the principles of the moral law itself as expanded in the statutes and judgments given at Sinai, with the various checks and restraints put on practices as blood revenge, polygamy, slavery, which it was not possible to remove at once, tended of necessity to a gradual elevation of the moral ideal, and to the ultimate abolition of the practices in question. It cannot but strike us that polygamy, slavery, blood revenge, and similar evils had all but disappeared in the time of our Lord, and hardly appear in the pictures of Jewish society in the Gospels. Part 2. The real character of the biblical revelation may now be looked at, and the objections taken to it in an ethical respect considered. It is, first of all, I would say, falsehood and calumny to speak of the Jehovah of the Old Testament as a capricious, cruel, passionate, and vengeful being. Caprice, partiality, favoritism have reference, I suppose, to the law of election, which conspicuously marks the divine procedure in Revelation. But arbitrariness is the last word to apply to this method of the divine action. What God does in his elections he does on wise and holy grounds. His election, which is a historical necessity, if a beginning is to be made somewhere, and his purpose is not to lose itself in indefiniteness, but is to be realized along definite lines, has not for its object exclusion, but an ultimate wider inclusion. Abraham was called, that in him and his seed all families of the earth should be blessed. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Israel was chosen to be God's servant, to carry the knowledge of God in due time to the Gentiles. Isaiah chapter 44, verses 1 through 8, etc. To speak of Jehovah's choice of Israel as a piece of private favoritism is to show a colossal ignorance of the ABC of the Bible's teaching. The other imputations on the divine character are equally baseless. From the beginning of the Bible, God is represented as a holy and righteous being, condemning sin, punishing the evildoer, protecting and rewarding the righteous. Everywhere his holiness, righteousness, wrath against sin, condescending grace, and covenant-keeping faithfulness are implied. Holiness, as the principle which guards the eternal distinction between creator and creature, Martinson, necessarily reveals itself in God as a zeal or jealousy for his own honor, Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and in reaction against daring and presumptuous transgression as wrath. Without an indignation that burns against sin in proportion to its heinousness, God would not be God, the absolutely holy one. Mercy or forgiveness would be emptied of all its value were there not this sense of the evil of sin and of God's holy judgment upon it behind. But cruel and vindictive the God of the Bible is not. On the contrary, his character is essentially merciful. Witness his name as revealed in awful majesty to Moses. The Lord, a God full of compassion and gracious, slow to anger and plenteous in mercy and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin, though it is added, that will by no means clear the guilty. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. Cross-reference Psalm 103, verses 8 through 18. The history is but a prolonged commentary on this character of God. It is stamped upon his law. It is written in his exhortations and commands. If this is the true character of the Jehovah of the Bible, the answer is already given to many of the objections drawn from the Bible characters. Jehovah's command to Abraham was, "Walk before me and be thou perfect." Genesis chapter 17, verse 1. Abraham's own challenge to him was, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Genesis chapter 18, verse 25. As his intercession for Sodom shows, Abraham knew perfectly clear the distinction between righteous and wicked. It is therefore incredible that the intention of the narrator should be to represent God as approving of, or indifferent to, Abraham's prevarications about his wife, which the patriarch weakly excused to his own conscience by the half-truth that Sarah was his sister by the father's side. Genesis chapter 20, verse 12. The plagues by which the sin was prevented showed God's estimate of the transaction. Genesis chapter 12, verse 17, and chapter 20, verse 18. God destroyed wicked Sodom with fire and brimstone. Genesis chapter 19, verse 24. How then should he be supposed to do aught but abominate the vileness of that city, or any taint that Lot or his daughters had contracted from it? David sinned grievously about Bathsheba and her husband. No palliation can be offered for his offense. But God sent Nathan to David to denounce him for his crime and declare his sore punishment, a denunciation which led to the king's sincere repentance. 2 Samuel chapter 12. How should it be represented as if the God of the Bible were implicated in or condoned David's transgression? I have read carefully in the book of Judges. It is the story of a rude, disorderly, and in many ways evil time. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. But what I see chiefly in the narrative is that when Israel forsook God, he gave them into the hands of their enemies, and they were grievously afflicted. But whenever they turned to him with the whole heart, he raised up saviors for them, and delivered them. When, moreover, I read of Deborah, of Gideon, of Boaz, and Ruth, I cannot regard this age, with all its faults, as wholly destitute of a nobler piety. The men of the Bible must be judged by the standard of their own age, not by ours. Judged even by that, they have faults grievous and many, and as respects these, are set forth as examples for our warning, not as models for our imitation. But the wholesale blackening of their characters in which certain writers indulge can only be described as malicious and unpardonable exaggeration. Only the crassest, surely, will believe that God chose Jacob as heir of the blessing because of his worldly cunning in overreaching Esau, or that David is pronounced to be the man after God's own heart because of his adultery with Bathsheba. There were far other and deeper things in these men, or they would not have occupied the place they do in the Bible. Despite his error in his evasion about his wife, an error which he, no doubt, thought an excusable means of defense for both, the character of Abraham is one of the noblest in the history of religion. Footnote. See the remarks of Maudslay's on Abraham in his Ruling Ideas, etc., page 21 and following. End of footnote. His heroic faith, his prompt and unhesitating obedience to God's word, his largesse of soul, which displays itself in all his conduct, his unfailing courtesy, unselfishness, and meekness, with which is joined, when need arises, the most conspicuous courage and decision, all vindicate for him the place he will continue to hold at the head of revelation, as the father of the faithful. Jacob's is a more complex character, deep, subtle, with a strong gravitation earthwards and a tendency to craft inherited perhaps from his mother, but none the less with a strong religious bent, a grasp of the ideal, a power of responding to God's revelations, a sense of the value of spiritual privilege, and on the whole a patient, faithful, affectionate spirit, which grew nobler and better as time went on. The substance, the strength of the chosen family, as Stanley says, the true inheritance of the promise to Abraham, was interwoven with the very essence of the upright man dwelling in tents, steady, persevering, moving onward with deliberate, settled purpose through years of suffering and prosperity, of exile and return, of bereavement and recovery. The dark, crafty character of the youth, though never wholly lost, for Jacob he is still called even to the end of his days, has been by trial and affliction changed into the prince-like, godlike character of his manhood. Footnote: Jewish Church, Volume 1, pages 46 and 56. See the whole sketch in Stanley in contrast with Mr. Blatchford's caricature of his pet aversion. End of footnote. David's character has its huge dark blot, and minor faults may be pointed out in it. But no impartial student of David's history can easily deny that the character which the Bible gives him as a man and king, who sought to do God's will, is well sustained throughout. His youth is blameless. His behavior at the court of Saul is without reproach. His relations with Saul and Jonathan are magnanimous and affectionate. His conduct as leader of a band of rude, rough men in the wilderness is such as to inspire them with the most devoted attachment. 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 15 through 18. His sorrow at the death of Saul and Jonathan is genuine and intense. His services to his nation as king were the greatest a ruler could render. His labors for the revival of religion and the worthy celebration of God's worship were the fruit of sincere conviction. The whole foundation of his character and his love to and trust in God, his rock, are laid bare in such a psalm as the 18th, which there need be no hesitation in ascribing to him. As I have said elsewhere, David's sins were great, but we may trust to Carlyle or a Maurice for a just estimate of his character, rather than the caviller whose chief delight is to magnify his faults. Footnote: Problems of the Old Testament, page 445. Cross-reference Carlyle, Heroes, page 72. Maurice, Prophets and Kings, pages 60 and following. End of footnote. Part 3. These attacks, then, on the characters of the men of the Bible may be dismissed, but what, it will be objected, of the other strains in the narrative, of God's tempting of Abraham, of his visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, of his commands to exterminate the Canaanites? It will be well to glance at these objections separately. The story of the sacrifice of Isaac stands in close connection with what is told of the gift of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, and with the hopes bound up in that child of promise. In this lay the essence of the trial. The story itself, it may be noted, is a witness to the early date of the narrative. The temptation described is such as could only belong to an early stage in the history. No Israelite would have invented such a tale about his progenitor, and the narrative cannot be explained as a reminiscence of any tribal event. The incident clearly presupposes that in Abraham's day, human sacrifice, especially the devotion of the firstborn to God, was a familiar fact of Canaanitish religion. That the temptation to sacrifice his son arose, as some suppose, from Abraham's own thoughts seems to me, in all the circumstances of the case, most improbable. The test was one truly imposed on him by the God who had given him his son. The object of the trial, however, was not to give approval of human sacrifice, but, as the event showed, after proof had been obtained of Abraham's willingness to surrender even his dearest and best at the call of God, Genesis chapter 22, verse 12, to put on such sacrifice the stamp of the divine disappropriation, and rule it out of God's worship for all time thereafter. Standing at the commencement of revelation to Israel, this incident barred out all thought of human sacrifice as an acceptable form of God's service. When objection is taken to the language in the second commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 8, about visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, the question may first be put, is it not the fact that in the natural order of things, the sins of parents are visited upon their children? What is the law of heredity but the declaration of this fact? One of the most terrible aspects of wrongdoing is that the penalties are seldom or never confined to the transgressor, but overflow on all connected with him, often most severely on his innocent offspring. This follows from the solidaric constitution of society. But the point is missed in the second commandment when the stress is laid on the unrelieved operation of this providential law. The contrast in this place is rather with what is said in the next clause about God showing mercy unto thousands of them that love him. Exodus chapter 20, verse 6. The entail of evil is viewed as descending only to the third and fourth generation. God is reluctant, as it were, to think of it descending further. But his mercy, in contrast, is viewed as descending to thousands of generations. Cross-reference Psalm 103, verse 17. Mercy in the prospect swallows up judgment. How different an aspect does the commandment assume when regarded in this light? The destruction of the Canaanites represents a real difficulty which everyone, I suppose, in proportion to the humanity of his disposition, feels. The various expedients which have been suggested for relieving it do not, I confess, bring much help to the mind. I can neither persuade myself, with the critics, that the command was not really given, nor can I rid my mind of the sense of awfulness in connection with it. One thing, however, I do see, that the judgment was not an arbitrary one, but was connected with a moral state. It had a moral basis. If the land was already, in the days of Abraham, promised to his descendants, Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, chapter 15, verse 7 and 18, chapter 18, verse 8, this was not without regard to the character of the inhabitants. The fulfillment is delayed to a later time, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. Sodom and Gomorrah already in that age furnished examples of the growing wickedness of the land. Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 18, chapter 18, verse 20, and chapter 19. The vileness of the inhabitants was such that in the days of Moses the land spewed them out. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 to 30. Their transgressions are dwelt on in Deuteronomy, verse 12, verses 29 to 32. Corruption, in short, had eaten into the core of this people. What was to be done with them? When the ancient world had become similarly corrupt, God destroyed it by a flood. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 8 and 11 through 13. When the Canaanites had filled up the cup of their iniquity, he gave them over to the sword of the Israelites. After all, as Otley says, quoting Westcott, the Canaanites were put under the ban, not for false belief, but for vile actions. Footnote, Aspects of the Old Testament, page 179, end of footnote. Nor was there any partiality in this. As I have said in my own Problems of the Old Testament, the sword of the Israelite is, after all, only a more acute form of the problem that meets us in the providential employment of the sword by the Assyrian, the Chaldean, or Roman to inflict the judgment of God on Israel itself, pages 471 to 472. If the difficulty is acute in the case of the Canaanites, we have to remember that this case, on account of its special aggravation, stands all but alone. Though belonging to a dispensation of severity, under which every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 2, yet judged of as a whole, and in its prevailing spirit, the law of Moses is not unmerciful. It is the very opposite. A spirit of humanity breathes through it such as is not met with in any other ancient code. Its laws of warfare even have many humane and considerate provisions. Deuteronomy chapter 12. They give no sanction to the dreadful barbarities and tortures, the impalings, flayings, blindings, mutilations, etc. of Assyrian and Babylonian conquerors. Footnote, David's treatment of the Moabites, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 2, and Ammonites, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 31, in this case under great provocation, and Amaziah's of the Edomites, 2 Chronicles chapter 25, verse 12, are not to be approved. For another spirit, cross-reference 2 Chronicles chapter 25, verses 3 and 4, the law, 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 21 to 23, the prophets. The severe treatment of Adonibezek in Judges chapter 1, verse 6 is somewhat different. It was, as he acknowledged in verse 7, a not unrighteous retribution for his own habitual cruelty. End of footnote. In besieging a city, the very fruit trees are to be spared, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 19 through 20. Captive women are to be delicately treated, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 to 14. The poor, the widow, the fatherless, the stranger, the homeless, the distressed are Jehovah's special care, and his law is full of provisions for them. Cross-reference, Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 through 27, chapter 23, verses 9 through 12, Deuteronomy, chapter 11, verses 7 and following, chapter 24, verses 14 through 22, etc. Private ill will is not to be allowed to enter into the treatment of an enemy. Exodus, chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 1 through 4. An illustration may be taken from the laws on bond service, which are often spoken of as a dark spot in the Hebrew legislation. The Mosaic Law did not establish bond service. It accepted it as an existing usage, laboring to the utmost to reduce and, as far as that was practicable, to abolish the evils connected with it. If from temporary causes a Hebrew lost the use of his freedom, the right to it was not thereby destroyed. It returned to him at the beginning of the 7th year. Exodus, chapter 21, verse 2, Leviticus, chapter 25, verses 39 and following. A law cannot be regarded as favorable to slavery, which makes man-stealing a crime punishable by death. Exodus, chapter 21, verse 16, and which enacts that a fugitive slave, taking refuge in Israel from his heathen master, is not to be delivered back to him, but is to be permitted to reside where he will in the land. Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 15 and 16. Bondsmen, both Hebrew and non-Israelite, were incorporated as part of the nation, had legal rights, sat with the other members of the family at the board of the Passover, took part in all religious festivals, and had secured to them the privilege of the Sabbath rest. The master was responsible for the treatment of his bondsman, and if he injured him, even to the extent of smiting out a tooth, the bondsman thereby regained his freedom. Exodus, chapter 21, verses 26 and 27. Humanity and kindness were constantly inculcated. When the Hebrew bondsman went out in the 7th year, he was to go forth loaded with presents. The one seeming exception is Exodus chapter 21, verse 20, the passage about the bondsman dying under chastisement. This, however, must be taken in connection with preceding laws. It certainly gives no sanction to the master to endanger his servant's life. The question is one of criminal jurisprudence. The case is presumed to be one of bona fide chastisement with the rod, and murderous intent. If present, had to be proved. If the slave died under the master's hand, such intent, at least sinful excess of anger, was held to be proved, and the master was surely punished. If he did not, even though he died afterwards, the master received the benefit of the doubt and escaped with a fine of money. The obvious aim of the law is not to place the bondsman at the master's mercy, but to restrict the master's power over him. Ancient law recognized no restriction. The whole design of the law, in one word, was to make men holy, as God was holy. Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. It was based on a moral code which, as Jesus said, had for its two great principles love to God and love to one's neighbor. Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. On this moral law was built the covenant between God and Israel. The tables of stone on which it was written, the tables of the testimony, Exodus chapter 32, verse 15, were the only objects in the Ark of the Covenant in Israel's holiest place. Footnote: see My Problem of the Old Testament, page 48. End of footnote. So far as the law mirrors it, the religion of Israel is ethical in its inmost fiber. I need not delay long on the ethical conceptions, for the elevated moral strain of these is uncommonly admitted. The critics in the main are with us here, for according to them it was the prophets who first gave a perfectly ethical character to Israel's religion. The prophets are nothing if they are not preachers of righteousness. Cease to do evil, learn to do well. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Micah chapter 6, verse 8. The Psalms in every line express an abhorrence of evil, and love of truth, righteousness, and mercy. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart. Psalm 24, verses 3 and 4. Cross-reference Psalm 1, Psalm 15, etc. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts. Create in me a clean heart, O Lord, and renew a right spirit within me. Psalm 51, verses 6 through 10. The book of Proverbs is a vade mecum to a straight, pure, virtuous life. He who guides himself by its wisdom will not go astray, but will find its counsels profitable for the life that now is, as well as for that which is to come. Proverbs, chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. 1 Timothy, chapter 4, verse 8. The one point on which a caveat may be raised here is in regard to the imprecatory psalms. Here indeed a note is heard which belongs to an older dispensation, and which Christians, who have learned a higher lesson in the school of Jesus, cannot ordinarily imitate. If the frequent prayers for the destruction of enemies in the Psalms were the expression of private revengefulness or hatred, they could not, of course, under any dispensation be defended. But that very plainly is not their real nature. The spirit of private revengefulness is as heartily condemned in the Old Testament as in the New. Cross-reference, Exodus chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, Psalm 7, verse 4. It is proud and triumphant wickedness, enmity to God and to his cause and people, which is the subject of these denunciations, prayers, and imprecations of doom. Let anyone read such psalms as the 4th, 7th, 9th, 10th, 12th, etc., and see if there is not a very real sense in which he can even yet sometimes share in them. End of section 19. Section 20 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chris Pyle. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. The Bible and Ethics, God and My Neighbor, Parts 4 and 5. Part 4. With what grace shall I now speak of defending the ethical teaching of Jesus and his religion that is exhibited in the pages of the New Testament? Where shall we look for purity like his, which descends into the inmost thoughts of the heart and forbids even the faintest uprisings of unholy passion and desire? Matthew chapter 5, verses 22, 28, etc. Where shall we find the inculcation of every virtue, of everything true, honorable, pure, lovely, of good report? Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Earnest, repeated, continuous, as we do in the apostolic writings. What can match the apostle's great hymn on love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13? How beautiful the cluster he presents of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. And how foul the catalogue of the works of the flesh to which he opposes it. Galatians chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. How comprehensively he argues, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law. Romans chapter 12, verse 10. How strenuously he exhorts to the fulfilling of all relative duties. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 and following. And chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Colossians chapter 3, verses 18 and following. Chapter 4, verse 1. How practical his everyday teaching. Let him that stole steal no more. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. If any will not work, neither let him eat. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. Denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we shall live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Titus chapter 2, verse 12, etc. Alike with Jesus and his apostles, the supreme test of discipleship is the doing of good works, the bringing forth of fruit unto holiness, the dying to sin and living to righteousness. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, chapter 7, verses 21 and following, John chapter 15, verse 8, Romans chapter 6, verse 22, Titus chapter 3, verse 8, etc. The whole end of redemption is that, being redeemed from all iniquity, God's people should be holy. Romans chapter 6, verse 6, chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, Galatians chapter 1, verse 4, Titus chapter 3, verse 14, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 24, etc. How gross a libel on Christianity it is to represent it as if sometimes done as immoral in character and tendency must already be evident from the above. Confirmation, however, if that is needed, may be drawn from the mouth of the adversary himself. Mr. Blatchford's book, God and My Neighbor, is in intention an attack on Christianity and the Bible. The impression I have formed in reading it is that Mr. Blatchford does not realize how much he himself owes to Christ and his ideals. He vehemently assails Christianity, but on what grounds? Paradoxical as it may seem, chiefly on the ground that Christian society fails to realize the ideals of its professed master. His picture of Christian society is chiefly a collection of shams, hypocrisies, self-indulgences, and vices is, no doubt, frightfully overdrawn. But let it pass, and see what he makes of it. Here are a few sentences. As London is, so is England. This is a Christian country. What would Christ think of Park Lane and the slums and the hooligans? What would he think of the stock exchange and the music hall and the racecourse? What would he think of our national ideals? Pausing again, over against Exeter Hall, I mentally apostrophize the Christian British people. Ladies and gentlemen, I say, you are Christian in name, but I discern little of Christ in your ideals, your institutions, or your daily lives. You are a mercenary, self-indulgent, frivolous, boastful, blood-guilty mob of heathen. If to praise Christ in words and deny him in deeds be Christianity, then London is a Christian city, and England is a Christian nation. For it is very evident that our common English ideals are anti-Christian, and that our commercial, foreign, and social affairs are run on anti-Christian lines. From the Preface. Once more, is Christianity the rule of life in America and Europe? Are the masses of people who accept it peaceful, virtuous, chaste, spiritually minded, prosperous, happy? Are their national laws based on its ethics? Are their international politics guided by the Sermon on the Mount? From Glasgow to Johannesburg, from Bombay to San Francisco, is God or Mammon king? Page 166 of the Popular Edition. What now does all this mean, I would ask, if not that the sin of Christendom is that it is not obeying the precepts of Christ, its Master, who is still held up as to be obeyed. It is his teaching, his ethics, his religion, which yield the standard by which the Christian peoples are judged and condemned. They ought to be living in accordance with Christ's teaching, but are not. If they did, it is implied, they would be peaceful, virtuous, chaste, spiritually minded, prosperous, happy. Were there ever so strange an indictment against a religion before? If to praise Christ in words and deny him in deeds is Christianity, then London is a Christian city, etc. But who will endorse this as a definition of Christianity? And if Christianity is not this, but the opposite of this, what do we come to but that it is the purest and best religion the world has yet seen? Christ is today the conscience of humanity. He is the touchstone, even for Mr. Blatchford, of what is good and evil. The same fallacy runs through the whole of this singular book. On a later page, page 197, we have drawn out the qualities of a really humane and civilized nation. In such a nation there should be no such thing as poverty, as ignorance, as crime, as idleness, as war, as slavery, as hate, as envy, as pride, as greed, as gluttony, as vice. But the author says this is not a humane and civilized nation, and never will it be while it accepts Christianity as its religion. He adds, these are my reasons for opposing Christianity. But who, with the least sense of fairness, does not see that the things he contends for are the very things which Christianity is constantly inculcating? These are Christian virtues. In the Christian ideal of the kingdom of God, every one of the things here contended for is embraced. Nay, in opposing Christianity, Mr. Blatchford is opposing the only agency that can produce them. Mr. Blatchford's reply to all this is that, however beautiful Christianity, ethically, may be in theory, it is a failure in practice. It is therefore not divine. Page 166. As will be seen later, it is far from true that Christianity is a failure in the sense intended, But one thing perfectly clear is that where Christianity fails, Mr. Blatchford's scheme, if scheme it can be called, will not succeed. In the nature of things, it cannot. Christianity holds up lofty ideals, but it does not stop there. It nourishes the sense of obligation and responsibility and furnishes motives and aids adequate to produce the results it aims at. It is the power of God unto salvation. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Mr. Blatchford has nothing of the kind to offer. On the contrary, he destroys the very possibility of the realization of his own ideals by his audacious denial of human freedom and accountability. Man, he glories to teach, is not a free agent but a machine. He is what heredity and circumstances have made him. He is not to blame for his wrongdoing. He cannot sin against God. I will not discuss this theory, uncompromisingly expounded in his chapter on determinism. I only point out the folly of seeking an ethical millennium along lines that do away with ethical conduct altogether. It is indeed a singular confusion when men oppose the service of God to the service of humanity, when God and my neighbor becomes God or my neighbor, which is pretty much Mr. Blatchford's point of view. What reader of the Bible does not know that the service of God includes service of my neighbor? In law, prophets, psalms, proverbs, gospels, epistles, love of the neighbor is never left out. What is made the chief part of practical religion? Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and to bring the poor that are cast out to thy house, etc.? Isaiah chapter 58, verses 6 and 7. Whoso hath the world's goods, and beholdeth his brother in need, and shutteth up his compassion from him, how doth the love of God abide in him? 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. James chapter 1, verse 27. Cross-reference chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. Jesus supremely inculcates love of the neighbor. Who can forget the parable of the Good Samaritan? Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. Even of the enemy. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. Cross-reference Romans chapter 12, verse 20. Only where secular ethics would fain divorce these two things, and make love of the neighbor independent of religion, the Bible connects them and pours into the earthly duty the whole force of the higher motive. Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 40. Separated from its true fountain in the love of God, the love of humanity dries up and dies. History is the proof of the intimate relation of the two, as will afterwards be shown. Part 5. The morality of Christianity has been assailed on various other grounds. The charge, e.g., has sometimes been brought against it that, while praiseworthy up to a certain point, the ideals of Jesus are narrow and limited in their outlook. F.D. Strauss may be the mouthpiece here. In the closing paragraphs of his New Life of Jesus, 1864, he says the life of man in the family retreats into the background with his teacher, who himself was without a family. His relationship towards the state was a purely passive one. He is averse to acquisition of property not merely for himself, because of his calling, but he is also visibly disinclined to it, and all that concerns art and the beautiful enjoyment of life remains completely outside of his circle of vision. Footnote: similar objections are urged by Mr. J.S. Mill in his Essay on Liberty, and latterly by Mazzini, Essays, Volume 5, page 363. See remarks on these writers by Rev. D.S. Cairns, Master of Arts, in his volume Christianity in the Modern World, Chapter 4. End of footnote. The one thing true in this objection is that in his intensely compressed public life, Jesus did not concern himself in his teaching with education, art, politics, science, trade, and 1,000 other human interests, in themselves most legitimate. He had infinitely greater things to occupy his mind, an infinitely greater work to do, infinitely greater truths to teach a world lost to the knowledge of God and the way of eternal life. In comparison with the work the Father had given him to do, the redemption of the world, the founding of the kingdom of God, the imparting of spiritual and eternal blessings, the restoring of lost men to the love and fellowship of their heavenly Father, all merely secular interests paled into insignificance. Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you, was his reproof to one who wished him to interfere in a question of inheritance. Luke chapter 12, verse 14. His life was full of sacrifice, and he knew that a cross awaited him at the end. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how I am straitened till it be accomplished. Luke chapter 12, verse 50. What sort of mind is it that can combine the thought of Jesus, these momentous interests weighing hourly on his spirit, with the idea of his giving little parlor or lecture hall discourses on poetry, painting, music, political economy, the best methods of education, or, say, of agriculture? The idea is preposterous. Yet it would be a totally false inference from these facts to assume that Jesus himself meant to belittle the importance of such matters in their own place, or that his religion is hostile to their cultivation or development. The very opposite is the case. One might ask, indeed, what kind of government was there in Christ's time, what sort of education, what forms of art, what species of science, of which one such as he could be expected to approve. Jesus came assuredly to make all things new in these as in every other department of life, to reconstitute society from top to bottom on new basis. His religion, e.g., strikes in its fundamental ideas at slavery, but he did not, therefore, begin a political crusade against slavery as existing in his time. Christ's teachings embody deep, enduring principles, set forth grand master truths, occupy themselves with the eternal, not with that which is simply temporal. It is this which gives Christ's words weight. Each age, as it comes round, finds them fruitful in applications to itself. Jesus commits himself to no one side in party politics, to no one denomination or party in the church, to no one form of church government or action exclusively, to no one mode of social organization, to no one solution of the questions of capital and labor, of rulers and subjects, of rich and poor. The reason is that the solution of these questions, proper to one age or stage of society, might not be the solution proper to another. And Jesus is not the teacher of one age only, else his words, like those of all other teachers, would become obsolete, but the teacher of all times and all ages. Hence his words never grow old, never are left behind in the world's progress. Footnote. This was one of the things which most powerfully impressed the late Professor Romanes. It becomes most remarkable, he says, that in literal truth there is no reason why any of his words should ever pass away in the sense of becoming obsolete. Thoughts on Religion, pages 157 to 158. End of footnote. Yet no one reading the Gospels would conclude that because of this Jesus was indifferent to the beauty of God's world, to human life and its relationships, to the necessity of civil government, to trade, industry, or any of the ordinary occupations of life. As I have written in another connection, the world to him is God's world, not the devil's. He has the deepest feeling for its beauty, its sacredness, the interest of God in the humblest of its creatures. His parables are drawn from its laws. He recognizes that its institutions are the expressions of a divine order. The world of nature and society, therefore, in all the wealth and fullness of their relations, are always the background of his picture. We see this in his parables, which have nothing narrow and ascetic about them, but mirror the life of humanity in its amplest breadth. The sower, shepherd, merchant, handicraftsman, the servants with their talents, and proving faithful and unfaithful in the use of them, the builder, the vineyard keeper, weddings, royal feasts, etc. Footnote. Christian View of God, page 357. End of footnote. Strange, truly, that any should think Jesus is indifferent to beauty and nature who remember his words on the lilies of the field. Matthew, chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. Or indifferent to beauty of thought, or word, or act, who recall his appreciation of Mary's deed in breaking the costly alabaster box of spikenard. Matthew, chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. Or indifferent to the family, who think of him as one to whom marriage was a divine institution to be jealously guarded, and who consecrated it by his presence and blessing. Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 9. John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, to whom human paternity was an image of the divine fatherhood, Matthew chapter 7, verses 9 through 11, and who took the little children in his arms and blessed them, Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 through 15, or indifferent to civil government, who considered that he inculcated and exemplified in practice the duty of submission to lawful authority, Matthew chapter 22, verses 19 through 21. Jesus had a higher ideal than national patriotism, even that of a universal kingdom of God. Yet he, like Paul, had the deepest love for his own nation and wept at the thought of its coming inevitable woes, Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Luke chapter 19, verses 41 and 42. Christ's morality, in brief, is not antisocial, and his religion has proved to be in history a constant source of inspiration to social and moral progress, to art, education, science, reforms, refinement of life, civil order, the elevation and purification of political ideas. The proof of this must be reserved for another paper, but it follows from the very nature of the religion. Christ's disciples are not to withdraw from the world, but are to live in it, and to be its salt and light. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. Out of this life in the world, in obedience to Christ's ideals, will spring a new type of marriage relation, of family life, of relations between masters and servants, of social life generally. It cannot be otherwise if Christ's kingdom is to be the secretly transforming influence he says it will be. Affection, intelligence, love of all things pure and beautiful will be quickened. Knowledge of nature will be sanctified, and science be pursued in a devout and reverent spirit. Order and industry, under righteous government, in society will lead to prosperity. The love of knowledge has ever attended the spread of true religion. Strange as it may sound to many, the great discoverers in science have mostly been religious men. Footnote. See the striking evidence of this in E. Neville's Modern Physics. On the influence of Christianity on art, there is an interesting supplementary chapter in Bruce's Gesta Christi, 2nd edition. End of footnote. End of section 20.
Section 21 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. Section 21. Discrepancies and Difficulties. Many find a chief ground of objection to the Bible in the discrepancies and mistakes in which its pages are alleged to abound. To read some writers, one would imagine that discrepancy and error were the chief features of the sacred book. There is a positive delight shown often in hunting up, multiplying, and mercilessly exposing these supposed mistakes of the Bible. Delitzsch speaks of the Widersprüchjägerei, the hunting for contradictions, characteristic of the modern critical school. Some of the alleged discrepancies are as old as the hills. Celsus, for example, serves up those on the resurrection. Others are genuine discoveries of the modern spirit. Popular infidelity willingly appropriates the material thus provided for it in the works of Christian and rationalistic writers, and thinks that thereby the Bible is effectually discredited. This raises at once the question which troubles so many minds as to whether inspiration is bound up with what is called inerrancy of the sacred record, that is, positive and absolute accuracy in even the minutest and seemingly most unessential details of historical, geographical, and chronological statements. If, it is argued, the Bible is an inspired book, must it not be free from error, even in the minutest degree, in outward as well as inward things? And is not this involved in a right conception of its infallibility as a rule of faith and practice? On this point, it should be frankly recognized that opinions differ, and to some extent are likely always to differ, among those who are the most devoted believers in and defenders of the Bible as, through and through, the inspired Word of God. It is not a question, really, which arises in our present discussion, for the issues between the defenders and the assailants of the Bible at the present moment are not of the minute character here described, but affect the claim of the Bible to be a veracious record of the history of God's revelations and the inspired vehicle of His message of salvation to mankind in any proper sense at all. I approach the subject from a somewhat different standpoint. Without attempting to adjudicate between rival theories of inspiration, or using watchwords like inerrancy, verbal inspiration, infallibility, which might breed debate and prejudice my treatment, I propose to offer some considerations which may tend to restore confidence in the Bible as a reliable book, and, by removing misconceptions, may incidentally throw useful light on the doctrine of inspiration itself. I take this line because I am persuaded that many of the disputes on inspiration arise from misunderstandings between the parties, which a more careful study of the facts of the Bible itself would do much to clear away. On the main point, I would only record my own conviction that the working of the objection from discrepancies has been vastly overdone. What continually impresses me, in a candid survey of the field of Scripture, is not the amount of error in the Bible, but how surprisingly free the sacred text is, judged with fairness, from anything that can be described as demonstrable contradiction or historical mistake. This of itself, if it can be established, may be felt to furnish a sufficiently striking proof of inspiration. Part 1. I may first clear the ground by ruling out of consideration a number of cases covered by principles already laid down, and in part illustrated in previous papers, or by principles which are in themselves obvious. Thus it is freely acknowledged, and is beyond dispute, that the books of the Bible, especially those of the Old Testament, have a long literary history, and though preserved by a wonderful providence of God from destruction or fatal corruption, have yet, to no small extent, undergone the vicissitudes to which all works frequently transcribed and handed down in more or less imperfect copies are liable. Errors in this way creep into the text, especially into names and numbers, and changes of a more serious kind occasionally occur, as from interpolation, explanatory annotation, editorial revision for a special purpose, for example, temple use of psalms, etc. Such causes give rise to difficulties, which it is the business of a cautious criticism to endeavor to remove, or at least to lessen. In the New Testament, the aids to textual criticism are abundant. In the Old Testament, they are much less so. Existing manuscripts but represent one exemplar, and we are thrown back on internal comparison of the books, or comparison with still more defective versions, or on conjecture. No theory of inspiration is here involved, and one can readily see by comparison of the books of Samuel and Kings with Chronicles how many seeming discrepancies in names, numbers, lists, etc. have this as their explanation. Thus, in 2 Samuel 8:4, we read 700 horsemen, where the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 18:4 has 7,000. In 2 Samuel 10:18, again, we have 700, where 1 Chronicles 19:18 has 7,000. In 2 Samuel 23:8, we have 800 slain, where 1 Chronicles 11:11 has 300. Here also the words in 2 Samuel Authorized Version, that sat in the seat, are probably a corruption for the Jashobim of 1 Chronicles, See Revised Version. 1 Kings 4:26 has 40,000 stalls, where 2 Chronicles 9:25 has the more likely number 4,000. The 50,070 men slain at Beth Shemesh, 1 Samuel 6:19, is almost certainly a corruption of the same order. Josephus has 70. And there are numerous other examples. As instances of changes in text, accidental or designed, Psalm 18 may be compared in its two versions in the Psalter and in 2 Samuel 23. Or Psalm 14, Jehovistic, may be compared with Psalm 53, Elohistic. Another class of cases of discrepancies which may be briefly dismissed are those which arise not from the text as we actually have it, but from the arbitrary assertion and hypotheses of criticism. The number of these discrepancies is legion, but they are mostly self-created. Thus, we have contradictory narratives of the creation in Genesis 1 and 2. But this depends on the critic's way of looking at the history. The two narratives are in no way parallel. The first gives an orderly account of the creation of heaven and earth. The second is not, in strictness, an account of the creation at all. It says nothing of the creation of heaven or earth, or of the general plant creation, but has for its object to show how man was dealt with by God at his creation, how he was placed in suitable surroundings, how a helpmeet was provided for him, etc. And the whole material is grouped from this point of view. In the book of Genesis itself, the narratives are connected in the closest way, Genesis 2:4, without the least sense of contradiction. A favorite method is to divide out a narrative among its several assumed authors, J, E, P, etc., then, treating each part as complete, to pit one against another and mark off the differences between them. As in reality, the parts of the narrative are closely interrelated, and all are needed to give the complete story. The semblance of contradiction is easily produced. Thus, the P writer is supposed to know nothing of a fall. Yet, as Wellhausen admits, he was acquainted with the J narrative of Genesis 3 and presupposes it. There is alleged to be contradiction between J and P as to the duration of the flood. Yet, when the narrative is taken as a whole, harmony, not discrepancy, is revealed. The story of Joseph is split up between two writers, J and E, who are affirmed to give discrepant accounts of the sale of Joseph and his fortunes in Egypt. But the ground for this discrepancy disappears if the narrative is accepted in its integrity. Wonderful things are made of the story of Moses and Aaron in Exodus, of the story of the mission of the spies, of the account of the rebellion of Korah. But the narratives have first to be torn to pieces before the discrepancies can be made out. Another part of the same method is to regard all resembling narratives, especially if found in distinct sources, as duplicates, and to evolve as before contradictions between them. Thus, Hagar's flight, Genesis 16, is identified with her expulsion by Sarah, chapter 21. Abraham's denial of his wife at Egypt, Genesis 12, is identified with his repetition of the offense at Gerar, chapter 20. Jacob's vision at Bethel before going to Padan Aram, Genesis 28:10 in pages, is identified with God's appearance to him on his return, Genesis 35 in pages. The call of Moses at the bush in Midian, Exodus 3:1 pages, is made the same as the revelation to him in Egypt, chapter 6:2 in pages, etc. Yet there are plain indications in the narratives themselves that the incidents mentioned are distinct, and generally the latter is seen to imply the earlier. but the contradictions of time, place, and circumstance fall if the incidents are not the same. I do not need to repeat what was said in a previous paper of the supposed scientific mistakes of the Bible. Defenders and impugners of the inspiration of the record alike need to bear in mind the fact that it is not the object of the Bible to give scientific descriptions of events in a form anticipative of 19th or 20th century discoveries. Its language is popular in character, in accordance with the standpoint of the observer and the state of knowledge of his time. Still, as was before observed, with a wonderful freedom from positive error. Talk, therefore, such as one sometimes hears about the mistakes of Moses, is wholly irrelevant. Such language might properly be used if it were the Babylonian myth of creation, Tiamat being cut in two by Merodach and heaven made from one half of her, earth from the other, that was being dealt with. But the Genesis narrative, in its monotheistic grandeur and the true and sublime ideas that inspire it, is above all such criticism. Similarly, in the story of the flood, the language employed is that of broad, popular description, as the catastrophe might appear to one who actually observed it. Beyond declaring the destruction of the race of mankind, there is no attempt, as there is no call, to describe scientifically the range or effects of the deluge. Part 2. I have next to remark that very many alleged discrepancies and errors not falling within the above classes are, when properly examined, found to be in reality no discrepancies or mistakes at all. This is frequently obvious from simple inspection. It is sometimes made clear by the progress of discovery. If no book has been so often assailed as the Bible, none has so often been vindicated from charges brought against it. Such, for example, are the biblical statements formerly referred to on the non-Semitic character of the early Babylonians, on the priority of Babylonian to Assyrian civilization, on the Semitic origin of Elam, on the power of the Hittites, on Sargon II and his siege of Ashdod, on the existence of Belshazzar, on the governorship of Quirinius, etc., all now corroborated by research and scholarship. Sargon claims in his inscription to be the conqueror of Samaria, but the impression given by the Bible narrative, 2 Kings 17, 3-6, though that interpretation is by no means necessary, is that the conqueror was Shalmaneser. Now it appears that after all, Shalmaneser was probably the conqueror of Samaria. I take an example of discrepancy cited in a recent able work and proof that our Lord's authority is not to be extended to his statements about the Old Testament. Let us test this, the writer says, by a simple case. He speaks of the drought in the days of Elijah as lasting 3 years and 6 months. The same statement is made in the Epistle of James, Luke 4:25, James 6:17. But in the first book of Kings, we are told that the rain came in the 3rd year, 1 Kings 18:1, which would make the drought about 2 years and a half, possibly less. How are we to explain the discrepancy? Even if, as the author supposes, Jesus was simply following here a current Jewish reckoning, it would not trouble me, for such cases undoubtedly occur, see below. But as a test case, the example is unfortunate, for there is no need for assuming any discrepancy. It is forgotten that in Palestine, rain is not an everyday occurrence as it is with us. The ground had already been dry for 6 months, since the previous rainy season, when Elijah stayed the rain by his word at the commencement of the new rainy season. If the cessation lasted till the 3rd year thereafter, the total period of drought would necessarily be about 3 years and 6 months. It was strictly true, therefore, that, as Jesus said, in the days of Elijah, the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months. Luke 6:25. Another instance, typical of many, may be taken from the Old Testament. The critics urge that Deuteronomy 10:3, according to which Moses himself made the ark before his second ascent of the mount, is in palpable contradiction to the narrative in Exodus 27:1 and pages, 37:1 and pages, where we are told that Moses received elaborate instructions for the making of the ark during his first sojourn on the mount, and that these were carried out by Bezaleel after his second descent. There is, however, no real discrepancy between Exodus and Deuteronomy on the matter. Moses, in Deuteronomy, at the distance of 40 years, and in the freedom of oratory speech, mentions the making of the ark as a receptacle for the tables without regard to chronology, and it is pedantic to understand him otherwise. Can anyone suppose, in view of the narrative in Exodus 34:1-4, which Deuteronomy admittedly follows, that the writer actually intended to convey that Moses, literally and with his own hands, constructed an ark of acacia wood in the interval between his receiving the command to hew the tables, verse 1, itself no slight work, and his rising up early the next morning to ascend the mount, verses 3-4? My imagination is not equal to the effort. A real difficulty lies in the large numbers frequently met with in the books of the Old Testament, in Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Some of these may be accounted for, as already seen, by corruption of the numbers, some by the use of round numbers, see below, and of large totals intended to convey a general idea where precise enumeration was not possible. For example, the accounts of David's census of Israel and Judah in 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 are evidently taken from the same original, yet the numbers in Samuel, verse 9, are 800,000 warriors for Israel and 500,000 for Judah. In Chronicles, verse 5, 1,100,000 for Israel and 470,000 for Judah. One is tempted here to suppose corruption, as in so many places elsewhere, or there may be a design change from some motive not known to us. Still, the enormous totals, compare 1 Kings 12:21, 2 Chronicles 11:1, 2 Chronicles 13:3-17, 14:8-9, 17:14 in pages, 26:13, etc., are not readily explained. And the expedients sometimes suggested for reducing the numbers have not much probability. Perhaps the best defense of the numbers is that they are uniformly so large. Every account and enumeration we have implies a population of unusual density and very large muster rolls of the males fit for war. It is remarkable that Dr. Flinders Petrie, in his Researches in Sinai, while advocating a method of reducing the numbers of the Israelites at the Exodus, which I think untenable, yet defends in the main the large numbers of the later books, especially of Judges, pages 219-20. He upholds the figures in the wars of Barak and Gideon, Judges 4:8, and says, "The last great fight before the monarchy, the civil with Benjamin, demands a roll call of 426,000 of all Israel. 1 in 10 of Israel are said to have been levied, or 40,000 to fight 26,000 of Benjamin." The extermination of a defeated tribe under these conditions is not surprising. The only figures we need set aside are those of the 22,000 and 18,000 Israelites who were slain. Yet why in so fierce a war of extermination? But the totals of men involved and the catastrophe which befell the tribe are not surprising. Page 220. End of section 21. Read by Danny Hamilton. Progreso, Yucatan, August 9th, 2022. Section 22 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. Section 22. Part 3. To obtain just views on this whole subject and perceive more clearly its relation to inspiration, we need to go a little deeper and ask ourselves more distinctly how inspiration, on any view we make of it, is related to the form of the record in Holy Scripture. On this point, a good deal of ambiguity and misunderstanding exists, which it is desirable, if possible, to remove. The phrase verbal inspiration is sometimes understood as if it were equivalent to a direct or mechanical dictation of the very words of inspired Scripture to its several authors. Conclusions are then drawn from this idea by opponents which, it is safe to say, no intelligent upholder of the inspiration of the Bible would consent to be bound by. I myself, partly for this reason, prefer to speak of a plenary inspiration. Plenary for the end for which inspiration is given, that is, viewing Scripture as a whole, the imparting in a complete and infallible way of the mind of the Spirit on the great subjects of God's revelation. It is by this time a commonplace with writers on inspiration of all schools that the action of the Spirit does not suspend or annul the natural workings of the human faculties, but quickens, exalts, and uses these to the fullest degree in the communication, orally or in writing, of the divine message. The books of the Bible show as clearly the marks of the individuality and genius of their human authors as they do of the mind of the Spirit expressed through them. When we trace further this action of the Spirit in relation to the form of the record, we get much light that is of use to us on the subject of discrepancies. To make my point clear at once, let anyone ask himself in what precise sense he uses the phrase verbal inspiration in regard to the words of our Lord. The first three evangelists have a great deal of common matter and report in many places the same sayings and discourses of Jesus. Yet, as everyone knows, while they often agree verbally, in a far larger number of cases, their reports show considerable variation of expression. It is not simply that one report is longer or shorter than another, but while the idea is the same, the words used to express the idea are often widely different. As instances, take the following from Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, Jesus says, "Blessed are ye when men shall reproach you and persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake." Matthew 5:2. Luke reports the same saying, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and reproach you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake." Luke 6:22. Matthew reads, "And be not afraid of them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing?" etc. Matthew 10:28-29. Luke gives this saying, "And I say unto you, my friends, be not afraid of them which kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. But I will warn you whom ye shall fear. Fear him which, after he have killed, hath power to cast into hell. Yea, I say unto you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, etc.?" Luke 12:5-6. Matthew gives the saying, "There be some of them that stand here which shall in no wise taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Matthew 16:28. Mark gives the latter part of this utterance, "till they see the kingdom of God come with power." Mark 9:1. And Luke yet more simply, till they see the kingdom of God, Luke 9:27. So constantly. Now, it is perfectly obvious that in all these passages, the thought or meaning is absolutely the same. But it is just as obvious that the form of expressing the thought varies, and that Jesus did not use both forms of expression at one and the same time. It is a difference in the mode of reporting the same thing. We see plainly, therefore, that it is the thought or idea about which inspiration is chiefly concerned, and not the precise words in which that idea is conveyed, though of course in Christ's sake the words are in substance the same also. Verbal inspiration can mean here only that the words are a perfectly accurate medium for conveying the meaning intended, not that they are always literally and exactly the very words Christ used, in the precise form in which he used them. This principle of itself is a solvent of many of the alleged discrepancies in the gospel. For example, in the case of the varying forms of the titles on the cross, Matthew 27:37, Mark 15:26, Luke 23:38, John 19:19. Part 4. A quite similar lesson is taught by another class of phenomena. I refer to the quotations from the Old Testament in the New. Some 250 of these are reckoned. There's great diversity in the mode of quotation, sometimes more exactly in agreement with the Hebrew, sometimes in freer paraphrase, or with unessential modifications, in the great majority of cases from the Greek versions known as the Septuagint, but here also often with considerable liberty. In many cases, the Greek version is followed where it deviates from the Hebrew in important respects. As example, in Matthew 2:5, 6, and thou, Bethlehem, land of Judah, etc. The differences are very considerable both from the Hebrew and from the Septuagint. These have Bethlehem, Ephrathah. Compare Micah 5:2. In Matthew 12:17-21, we have, with other changes, the adoption of the Septuagint rendering, in his name shall the Gentiles hope. For the Hebrew, the isles shall wait for his law. Isaiah 42:1-4. In Romans 9:33 and 1 Peter 2:6, the Septuagint is followed in rendering the last clause of Isaiah 28:16, shall not be put to shame, where the Hebrew has, shall not make haste. To take only one other case, in Hebrew 10:5-7, the Septuagint, as usual in this epistle, is followed even in the rendering of Psalm 46. A body hast thou prepared me, where the original has, mine ears hast thou opened, digged. In brief, the sacred writers took their quotations from this Greek version, the one familiar to their readers, where it served in illustration of their main point, without troubling themselves, except in special cases, with its greater or less precision of rendering in detail. Inspiration, as before, shows itself concerned with the thought, not with the precise form of words used to express it. An older writer, Dr. Patrick Fairbairn, has some sensible remarks on this subject, which I may venture to quote. After observing that, in none of the cases are we presented with a different sense, but simply with a modified representation of the same sense, he proceeds. It is, therefore, a groundless and unwarranted application to make of these occasional departures from the exact import of the original when they are employed as an argument against the plenary inspiration of Scripture. Even in those cases in which, for anything we can see, a closer translation would have served equally well the purpose of the writer, it may have been worthy of the inspiring spirit and perfectly consistent with the fullest inspiration of the original Scriptures that the sense should be given in a free current translation. The stress occasionally laid in the New Testament upon particular words and passages of the Old sufficiently proves what a value attaches to the very form of the divine communications. It shows that God's words are pure words, and that, if fairly interpreted, they cannot be too closely pressed. But in other cases, when nothing depended upon a rigid adherence to the letter, the practice of the sacred writers not scrupulously to stickle about this, but to give prominence simply to the substance of the revelation, is fraught with an important lesson, since it teaches us that the letter is valuable only for the truth couched in it, and that the one is no further prized and contended for than may be required for the exhibition of the other. A third group of cases of interest in this connection are those which relate to the use of round and indefinite numbers. Without accepting the principle of systematized numbers to the extent to which some would carry it, we must recognize that the use of round or indefinite numbers, where the precise figure perhaps was not known, is a not uncommon fact in Scripture. 40 is a favorite round number of this kind, as seen, for example, from its frequent use in the book of Judges. Judges 3, 2, 30, 40 times 2 equals 80. Verse 31 and 8:28, etc., where it is intended to express that the whole armed force of the nation is called out, or that an army is half destroyed. Large round numbers, based on census lists or current enumerations, are employed. This seems the simplest way of explaining such very large figures, which it is impossible to take literally, as in 2 Chronicles 8:3-17. This principle rules in another way, in giving a certain technical or artificial form to genealogies and lists. Thus, the list of the 70 souls that went down to Egypt in Genesis 46:8-27, described in Exodus 1:5 as all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob, embraces Jacob himself, and Onan, who died in Canaan, represented by Hezron and Hamul. Verse 12, these were born in Egypt. And Joseph's 2 sons, expressly stated to have been born in Egypt. Verse 27. In our Lord's genealogy in Matthew 1, the names are given in 3 14s. Verse 17. Yet to make the second 14, 3 names of kings have to be omitted. A chronological difficulty is sometimes found in Paul's statement in Acts 13:20. After that he gave them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet, Authorized Version, which conflicts with the 480 years given in 1 Kings 6:1 as the period from the Exodus till the founding of Solomon's temple. The discrepancy might, if it were real, be solved on the above principle of the adoption of a current reckoning, where precise enumeration is not intended. In reality, the difficulty disappears with the true reading. He gave them their land for inheritance for about 450 years, and after these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet, Revised Version. The allusion in the passage is probably to the very reckoning in 1 Kings 6:1. Part 5. Let me now take a class of cases of a different kind. Many of the books of the Bible are compilations from older records. They use, and in some cases embody, materials derived from uninspired sources. For example, the letters of the Persian kings embodied in the book of Ezra, portions of state chronicles, genealogies, tribal lists, etc. But they also embody older prophetic histories and biographies. Compare 1 Chronicles 29:29, 2 Chronicles 9:29, 12:15, 13:22, 26:22, etc. Some of these documents had been handed down for centuries and doubtless had suffered in the usual way in the process of copying and transmission. What relation does inspiration sustain to such materials? Is its function ended in their faithful reproduction and use is given for the purpose intended by the Spirit of God? Or does it lie with inspiration to supply all defects, correct all corruptions in names and numbers, check mistaken readings, and the like? It will be very difficult to maintain that it does. Perhaps an illustration from Matthew Hendrie, whose devotion to Scripture, even in its letter, will not be gainsaid, may set this matter in a clearer light. He is speaking of the genealogies and chronicles, with special reference to 1 Chronicles 8, 1 through 32. As to the difficulties, he says, that occur in this and the foregoing genealogies, we need not perplex ourselves. I presume Ezra took them as he found them in the books of the kings of Israel and Judah, chapter 9, 1. According as they were given in by the several tribes, each observing what method they thought fit. Hence, some ascend, others descend. Some have numbers affixed, others places. Some have historical remarks intermixed, others have not. Some are shorter, others longer. Some agree with other records, others differ. Some, it is likely, were torn, erased, and blotted, others more legible. Those of Dan and Reuben were entirely lost. This holy man wrote as he was moved of the Holy Ghost, but there was no necessity for the making up of the defects. No, nor for the rectifying of the mistakes of these genealogies by inspiration. It was sufficient that he copied them out as they came to hand, or so much of them as was requisite for the present purpose, which was the directing of the returned captives to settle as nearly as they could with those of their own family and in the place of their former residence. In such cases, as I have ventured to remark elsewhere, inspiration does not create the materials of its record, but works with those it has received. In strictness, the providing and preserving of sound historical material for the sacred record is the work of providence rather than that of inspiration, and a wonderful providence it has been. For instance, Luke appeals for the trustworthiness of his gospel, not to his inspiration, but to the fact of his having traced the course of all things accurately from the first, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses of the word. Luke 1, 1 through 3. Inspiration is a free, living force which informs and molds the material thus received for the ends which God designs in his written word. Part 6. On the principle now stated, one might easily explain the appearances of discrepancy occasionally met with in the narratives of the Gospels, without detracting in any way from the reality of inspiration. For example, as to whether Bartimaeus was cured by Jesus on his going into or his coming out of Jericho. Compare Matthew 20, 29, 30, Mark 10, 46, Luke 18, 35. Such cases, however, seem to me to be perfectly explicable on other and more probable lines. They belong to that part of the synoptic tradition which may be supposed to have assumed a fixed form while yet the apostles were laboring together in Jerusalem, and it is a priori highly unlikely that the statements in the different evangelists are actually discrepant. I would conclude, therefore, with a few remarks on certain principles which apply to the alleged discrepancies in the gospel. Many of these so-called discrepancies, as already seen, are not real. It is not a real discrepancy if a saying is reported or an incident related in slightly varying language, or if one narrative is fuller than another, or gives detail which another omits, or if it presents incidents from a different point of view. It is not a true discrepancy, for example, if Matthew tells of two demoniacs at Gadara, Matthew 8:28, while Mark and Luke speak only of one, Mark 5:2, Luke 8:27. or if Matthew speaks of 2 blind men at Jericho, Matthew 20:30, while Mark and Luke again tell only of one, Mark 10:46, Luke 18:35. As Matthew Hendrie, in his quaint way, puts it, if there were 2, there was one, on Mark 5:1 and pages. A letter comes in as I write, which affords an interesting illustration of this very point. In Huxley's Darwiniana, the professor makes 2 references in different papers as to the origin of the breed of Ancon sheep. Here are the 2 passages. At pages 38-39, with the cuteness characteristic of their nation, the neighbors of the Massachusetts farmer imagined that it would be an excellent thing if all his sheep were imbued with the stay-at-home tendencies enforced by nature on the newly arrived ram, and they advised Wright to kill the old patriarch of his fold and install the Ancon ram in his place. The result justified their sagacious anticipations. At page 409, it occurred to Seth Wright, who was, like his successors, more or less cute, that if he could get a stock of sheep like those with the bandy legs, they would not be able to jump over the fences so readily. And he acted upon that idea. Italics mine. My correspondent suggests this as a parallel to the alleged discrepancy between Deuteronomy 1:9 in pages and Exodus 18. Compare my probus of Old Testament, page 278. But it is quite as applicable to many of the so-called discrepancies of the Gospels. One principle which explains at least some of the apparent discrepancies in the Gospels is that of the occasional grouping. There seems no doubt that, having regard to the spirit rather than to the exact letter of their narratives, the evangelists in certain instances allow themselves the freedom of grouping or combining their material. In the discourses, this is commonly allowed. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, for example, long passages are brought together, which in Luke are found in quite different connections. Compare Matthew 6:9-13, Luke 11:1-4, Matthew 6:25-33, Luke 12:22-31, Matthew 7:7-11, Luke 11:9-13. No doubt Jesus repeated many sayings at different times and places, but in part there is plainly a grouping of like material where occasion offers. The same applies to the incidents. This is probably, for example, the real explanation of the diversity in the accounts of the cure of the blind men on the occasion of Christ's visit to Jericho. Luke narrates the cure of a blind man as Jesus drew nigh to Jericho, Luke 18:35-43. Mark narrates the cure of blind Bartimaeus, naming him as Jesus went out from Jericho, Mark 10:46-52. Matthew gives the story of the cure of 2 blind men as Jesus leaves Jericho, Matthew 20:30-34. The accounts of the cure in the 3 cases are very similar. It is simplest to suppose that there were really 2 cures, one at the entering, the other at the leaving of the city, and that Matthew's account is the synopsis of the 2. Much difficulty has often been felt in regard to the harmonizing of the 2 genealogies of Jesus. These are found, one in Matthew 1:1-18, the other in Luke 3:23-38. One descending, the other ascending, and they vary completely after the mention of David. They are both in form genealogies of Joseph, but they plainly represent quite different lines of descent. We must assume, therefore, holding them as we do for genuine, that they are constructed on different principles. The view has often been advanced in modern times that one is the genealogy of Joseph, Matthew, the other the genealogy of Mary, Luke. But most scholars now reject this as contrary to the fair meaning of the text. Yet in reality, if not in form, there is every probability that the genealogy of Mary is involved. The supposition which has most likelihood is that, as Lord A. Hervey in his work on the subject argues, the genealogy in Matthew represents the legal, that in Luke, the natural descent of Joseph. Both appear to touch in Mathan or Mathat, the grandfather of Joseph, and here we may naturally suppose that the key to the solution lies. Jacob is the son of Mathan in Matthew's list, 1:15. Haley is the son of Mathat in Luke's, 3:24. If we suppose Jacob to have had no sons, but only a daughter, Mary, whom Joseph the son of Haley married, then Joseph, as next of kin in the male line, became, on Matthew's principle, the son of Jacob, and legal heir to the throne. Mary and Joseph, on this view, were related as cousins. The only other example I take is that of the alleged discrepancies in connection with the narratives of the resurrection. The accounts of the resurrection of Jesus in the four Gospels are declared by many to be perfectly irreconcilable. Is this certain? I am far from thinking so, if the narratives are treated in a reasonable way. The resurrection day was one of great excitement. Events and experiences were mingled, grouped, blended in a way which no one who was not an eyewitness, like John, would venture afterwards to attempt to disentangle. The different evangelists give outstanding names and facts, without pretending to furnish complete or detailed accounts. In default of more precise knowledge, their statements are more or less generalized. John alone, probably for the very end of giving greater precision to certain events in which he was concerned, furnishes a clear and consecutive statement. Yet through the whole, the main facts stand out clearly. The early visit of the women to the sepulchre, Mary Magdalene grouped with the rest, though in reality she may have gone earlier. The stone rolled away. The vision of the angels and their message. The appearances to the women and to Mary Magdalene again grouped in the narrative of Luke. The going to tell the disciples, Mary's going and that of the other women grouped again. John makes the order of events a good deal clearer. Mary Magdalene probably arrived first. It may be with the other Mary as companion. Compare the we in John 20:2. The rest of the women coming somewhat later. But on seeing the stone rolled away, she immediately fled and told Peter, returning in the wake of Peter and John to the tomb. Then followed the vision of angels and the meeting with Jesus in the garden, according to Mark 16:9, in addition to the gospel based here on John, Christ's first appearance. Meanwhile, the other women had received the angel's message and departed, filled with fear, joy, and amazement. One point on which real difficulty rests is whether the appearance of Jesus to the women in Matthew 28:8-9 is a distinct event, or whether, as some think, the passage is to be taken as simply a generalized statement of the single appearance to Mary Magdalene recorded by John. It seems most naturally to refer to a distinct or second appearance of Jesus. If so, then somewhat more time must have elapsed during or after the women's visit to the sepulchre than we should otherwise have supposed. Time to allow of Mary's return and of Christ's appearance to her. Possibly Mary overtook the others on their way back, and all told the apostles together. The events of the resurrection morning thus do fit into each other better than the ordinary catalogue of minute discrepancies would suggest. It is at least an exaggeration to say, it is hardly too much to affirm that, as they, the synoptic narratives, stand, they agree only in their unfaltering and triumphant proclamation of the fact that Jesus rose and appeared to his disciples. Smith, p. page 36. End of section 22. Read by Danny Hamilton. Progreso, Yucatan. August 9th, 2022.
Section 23 of the Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ron Altman. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. The Bible, the Hope of the World. It was remarked in the first paper that the best proof of the inspiration of the Bible is the spiritual effects which it produces. These are of a character writ large on the page of history. Moses extolled the unique privilege of Israel in having, quote, statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, unquote. Deuteronomy 4, verse 8. Psalmists celebrate in glowing terms the spiritual power of God's law in converting, enlightening, sanctifying, comforting, and guiding the soul. Psalms 1, Psalms 19, verse 7, 11, and Psalm 119. Paul counts it the chief privilege of his nation that, quote, they were entrusted with the oracles of God, unquote. Romans 3, verse 2. The same apostle declares that the Old Testament scriptures which Timothy possessed were, quote, able to make wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus, unquote, and that as inspired of God, they were profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, quote, that the man of God may be complete, furnished completely unto every good work, unquote. 2 Timothy 3, verses 15 to 17. The New Testament scriptures have since been added to the Old, and we have now in our hands a complete Bible. Few will maintain that the inspiration of the New Testament falls beneath that of the Old, or that the spiritual powers its teachings exert are less wonderful than those of the earlier scriptures. The claim made for the Bible is one that can be put to the test. The Bible influences the world through the many-sided revelations of God's character and will it contains. It specially influences it through the historical image and the moral and spiritual teaching of Christ in the Gospels, and through the hopes, promises, exhortations, and motives in which the apostolic writings abound. We speak with gratitude of the profound influence which has been exercised on the world by Christianity. But it is to be remembered that Christianity only comes to men and is kept alive in their memories and hearts through the Bible, through the possession, translation, diffusion, and devout and prayerful reading, preaching, study, and teaching of the written word. Without the Bible to revert to, keeping the truth fresh and living, the image of the Master would long since have been blurred and distorted beyond recognition. His gospel would have been perverted beyond recovery by corrupt human tradition. His doctrines and moral teaching, with those of his apostles, would have been buried under a mountain load of human inventions. It is not, therefore, an exaggeration to say that it is the Bible which has preserved Christianity to the world. If, as we believe, the religion of Jesus is the hope of the world, It is the possession of the Bible conveying and maintaining the knowledge of that religion which makes the hope possible. In saying that Christianity is the hope of the world, and that the Bible is the hope of the world, we use nearly equivalent expressions. Part 1. A powerful argument for the divineness of the Bible might be drawn from a simple comparison of the Bible with the sacred books of other religions. There is a large group of religions in the world which students of the subject are accustomed to designate book religions. This for the reason that they possess, like our own, sacred books or scriptures. Such books are the Hindu Vedas, the Parsi Zen Avesta, the Tripitakas and other sacred writings of the Buddhists, the Mohammedan Koran. Whatever light of wisdom or gleams of truth about God and duty such books contain, and we need grudge to them no real gems of this kind they possess, there is, as every candid judge will be ready to admit, no true comparison between these ethnic scriptures, even at their best, and the collection of writings which we term preeminently the Bible, the book. Whether regarded as literature, as history, or in the message they convey, the unique superiority of the Bible stands out unchallengeable. Take the Bible, for instance, as history. It is the simple fact that there is nothing that can be properly called history in these other sacred books of the world. They are, as every student of them knows, for the most part, jumbles of heterogeneous material loosely placed together without order, continuity, or unity of any kind. There is no order, progress, or real connection of parts. The Koran, for example, is a miscellany of disjointed pieces loosely placed together, arranged chiefly in order of length. The Bible, on the other hand, is a history with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A history of revelation, the history of a developing purpose of God, working up to a goal in the full-orbed discovery of the will of God for man's salvation in his Son, Jesus Christ. There is nothing like this, nothing even approaching it, in any other collection of sacred books in the world. As distinctive in its character is the message of the Bible. The Bible is not a book of mere secular wisdom, though much secular knowledge is embodied in it, not a book merely of grand thoughts about religion or of theories and speculations about divine things, not a book simply of fine ethical teaching, of noble biography, of soul-stirring narrative. It is, as just said, preeminently a book of revelation, of God's historic revelations down through the ages to the coming of Christ and the advent of the Spirit. These revelations form a series. Each adds something to those which went before. Each carries the course of revelation a little further. Each foreshadows a yet richer development in the future, and when the whole is before us, we see in it the unfolding of a great purpose which has its consummation in Christ and his redemption, a purpose the very character of which is the guarantee to us that it is the purpose of God, not the thought of man. Part 2. This imperfect glance suffices to show the uniqueness of the Bible and the inestimable treasure we possess in it. We are now to see how the Bible verifies its exceptional character and claims by its history and influence, and by the blessings it confers. It is not too much to say that the Bible, regarded simply as a book, has had an unexampled place in history. Its authors were not learned men, as the world counts learning, yet their writings have been preserved, read, copied, translated, and spread abroad to the utmost corners of the earth, as no works of philosophers or sages, poets or orators, historians or moralists have ever been. Take the witness of manuscripts. While of some important classical works only one manuscript is known to exist, and 10 or 15 is thought a large number for others, few of these dating beyond the 10th century of our era, the manuscripts of whole or parts of the New Testament are already reckoned by thousands, the oldest of which go back to the 4th and 5th centuries, and parts are still older. Or take the test of translation as a mark of this book's influence. It is no uncommon thing for a popular book to be translated into many languages. Here again, however, the Bible has a record which casts every other into the shade. The books of the New Testament had hardly been put together in the 2nd century in what we call the canon, before we find translations made of them into Latin and Syriac and Egyptian, and by into Gothic and other barbarous tongues. In the Middle Ages, notwithstanding the discouragements put upon the possession and reading of the Scriptures, we find translations made into nearly all the leading languages of Europe. With the art of printing, the work of translation received a new impetus. Today there is not a language in the civilized world, hardly a language among uncivilized tribes of any importance, into which this marvelous book has not been rendered. Whatever men may say of decay of faith in the Bible, it is, as remarked earlier, the undeniable fact that its circulation in the different countries and languages of the world today outstrips all previous records. The reports, for example, of the 3 great Bible societies, the British and Foreign, the American, and the National Bible Society of Scotland, show for the year 1905 the enormous total of over 9 million of issues of the whole or parts of the Scriptures in European and heathen lands. Every other test we can apply to the Bible yields a similar result. No book has ever been so minutely studied, has had so many books written on it, has given birth to so many commentaries and works of exposition, has evoked such keen discussion, has founded so vast a literature of hymns, liturgies, works of devotion, has been so determinedly assailed, has rallied such splendid defenses as the Bible. Why do I mention these things? Not merely for their own interest as facts, but as proofs of the unconquerable vitality which resides in this book, of the universal appeal it makes to human hearts, and of the need of ascribing the power it exercises to some higher than natural cause. Genius alone in the writers, even if they were allowed to take rank as men of genius, would not explain it. What boasts are sometimes made of the genius and scholarship ranged against the Bible! Yet, as I said at the commencement, the Bible holds on its career of conquest unchecked, while the works of its assailants, after a generation or two, often much less time, lie on the shelves unread. These books have no message to the world, as the Bible has. The Bible is a book, as experience shows, for all races, and it has this character because, like the gospel it enshrines, it goes down beneath all differences of rank, age, sex, culture, to that which is deepest, most universal in man. It bears translation into all languages, because the language of the deepest things of the soul is, all the world over, one. This vital, penetrative character of the Bible, attesting its divine quality, shows itself not simply in the place it holds in history, but in the unexampled character of the influence it has been enabled to exert. To tell what the Bible has been and done for the world would be to rewrite in large part the history of modern civilization, to retell the story of Christian missions, including those which brought the gospel to our own shores, to extract the finest qualities in much of our best literature, to lay bare the inner springs of the lives of those who have labored best and most for the moral and spiritual well-being of their kind. Trace back to their springs the great movements, the great struggles for civil and religious liberty in our own and other lands, the social and humanitarian movements which were the distinction of the past century. The sources will be found ultimately in the high mountain levels of the Bible's teaching. And say what men will, it is the Bible which is the source of our highest social and national aspirations still. I shall return immediately with more particularity to the proof of these statements, but I may here cite the witness of one who will not, I think, be regarded as unduly biased in favor of the Bible. I mean Professor Huxley. Secularist and agnostic as he was, Professor Huxley on more than one occasion expressed himself in very remarkable terms on this unparalleled influence of the Bible. Here is one of his latest utterances. Quote, "Throughout the history of the Western world," unquote, he says, quote, "the Scriptures, Jewish and Christian, have been the great instigators of revolt against the worst forms of clerical and political despotism. The Bible has been the Magna Carta of the poor and of the oppressed. Down to modern times, no state has had a constitution in which the interests of the people are so largely taken into account, in which the duties, so much more than the privileges, of rulers are insisted upon, as that drawn up for Israel in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Nowhere is the fundamental truth that the welfare of the state in the long run depends on the uprightness of the citizen so strongly laid down. Assuredly, the Bible talks no trash about the rights of man, but it insists upon the equality of duties, on the liberty to bring about that righteousness which is somewhat different from struggling for rights, on the fraternity of taking thought for one's neighbor as for one's self." Unquote. Here is another passage. Arguing in one of his essays for the reading of the Bible in the schools, Professor Huxley bids us consider, quote, that for 3 centuries this book has been woven into the life of all that is best and noblest in English history, that it has become the national epic of Britain, that it is written in the noblest and purest English, and abounds in exquisite beauties of mere literary form, unquote. And he asks, quote, by the study of what other book could children be so much humanized and made to feel that each figure in that vast historical procession fills, like themselves, but a momentary space in the interval between 2 eternities, and earns the blessings or the curses of all times, according to its efforts to do good and hate evil, even as they also are earning their payment for their work, unquote. Are not statements like these the best reply to such strictures on the narrowness of the Christian ethics as we had before us in a previous paper? Can a religion be really regarded as inimical to political freedom, to duties of citizenship, to education, to patriotism, which produces results like the above? Part 3. Let me now trace a little more in detail some of the actual blessings which the world owes to the Bible. For practical purposes, the influence of the Bible and the influence of Christianity are, as I have said, convertible ideas. It will be convenient for me to speak first of what the world owes to the religion of Christ in a temporal respect, on the plane of moral and social benefit, then of what the world owes to it in a spiritual respect, or in regard to its eternal hopes. There are, I know very well, and we are never allowed to forget it, 2 sides to this picture. Deeds have been done in the name of Christ and of his official church, which reflect eternal dishonor upon humanity. It is a dark picture the historian has to draw of the abounding corruption, the dead formalism, the gross immorality of certain ages of the Church, of the frightful evils of the periods of Roman and Byzantine ascendancy, of the spirit of intolerance and persecution directed against heretics and unbelievers, and often against Christ's own faithful witnesses, when truth had to be confessed in peril of the dungeon and the stake, of superstitions like witchcraft, of the feuds and divisions of churches and sects, of the moral blots, the inconsistencies, the festering sores of vice and misery of our so-called Christian civilizations. We acknowledge it all and blush in the acknowledgment. To dwell on such things is the stock in trade of the anti-Christian agitator. But in this he is unjust. A fair mind will always distinguish, or try to distinguish, between effects really due to the spirit and principles of Christ's religion and the false and perverted readings of that religion given by those who had nothing in common with its spirit, and made it too often the engine of their own temporal ambitions. Much human infirmity and folly must be stripped off if we are to do justice to this religion as it lies before us in the Bible. Mr. Blatchford's formerly quoted words, quote, "If to praise Christ in words and deny him in deeds be Christianity, unquote, is not the definition we would accept of Christianity. To Christ himself we appeal, as against the people who deny him. If, then, we look to the gospel as it came forth in its purity from the lips of Christ himself and of his apostles, what do we find it teaching? What ideas did it communicate to the world? I look at the subject first as proposed from the standpoint of moral and social benefit. To understand what the religion of the Bible has accomplished, we have to think of the kind of world into which Christianity entered. It found a world in the last stage of dissolution, in a state of utter decrepitude and decay. The old religions had lost their power, and with religion the foundations of morals were well nigh universally loosened. Dissoluteness flooded society. Even duty to the state, the one duty that was held supreme, was breaking up in all directions. There was little sense of individual right. In the family, for example, the father held all power in his own hands, and wife and children and slaves were subject to his absolute authority. Infanticide and exposure of children were common and recognized practices. The social structure was built on slavery, and slaves had no protection of any kind. Work was held to be beneath the dignity of citizens who, if not possessed of wealth, claimed to be supported by the state. The favorite amusements of the populace were the sanguinary spectacles of the amphitheater. Marriage had fallen into such disuse that though the emperors set a premium on marriage, people could hardly be induced to enter into the bond. Worse than all, heathen society had not within itself, nor was it able to find, any principle of regeneration, for religion had lost its hold. The moral codes of the philosophers were without sufficient sanction, and there were not those ideas of the dignity and worth of the individual which could create any noble or sustained efforts on his behalf. Noble examples of virtue, no doubt, there still were. Friendship, piety of a sort, family affections, a deploring on the part of the better spirits of the evils they could do nothing to check or subdue. But ancient civilization had played itself out in both thought and life, and had not a spring of renewal from which recovery could come. What now did Christianity bring to this effete and corrupt and sinking heathenism? It brought, for one thing, a totally new idea of man himself as a being of infinite dignity and immortal worth. It taught that every man, as made in God's image and capable of eternal life, had an infinite value, a value which made it worthwhile God's own Son dying for him. It taught that no man was worthless in God's sight, that every man, however lost in sin, was redeemable, and that no efforts should be spared for his redemption. It brought back the well-nigh lost sense of responsibility and accountability to God. It breathed into the world a new spirit of love and charity, something wonderful in the eyes of the heathen, who looked on in amazement as they saw institutions growing up around them such as paganism had never heard of. institutions for the care of the poor, the orphan, the aged, the helpless, the fallen, the leper. That wealth of charitable and beneficent institutions with which Christian lands are full. It flashed into men's souls a new moral ideal, and set up a standard of truth, integrity, and purity, which has acted as an elevating force on moral conceptions till this hour. It restored woman to her rightful place by man's side, as his spiritual helpmate and equal. It taught care for the children, and created that best of God's blessings on earth, the Christian home. It taught the slave his spiritual freedom as a member of the kingdom of God, gave him an equal place with his master in the church, and struck at the foundations of slavery by its doctrines of the natural brotherhood and dignity of man. It created self-respect and a sense of duty in the use of one's powers for self-support and the benefit of others, urged to honest labor, and in a myriad ways, by direct teaching, by the protest of holy lives, and by its general spirit, struck at the evils, the corruptions, the malpractices, and cruelties of the time. In all these, and in numberless other ways that cannot now be mentioned, Christianity, as impartial investigators recognize, entered as a revolutionizing, regenerating, and renewing principle into that ancient society, and produced effects which have borne fruit in the new world that has sprung up on the ruins of the old. End of section 23. Section 24 of The Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ron Altman. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. The Bible, the Hope of the World, Part 4. Once the ideas I have mentioned had been introduced, and had taken possession of the world, they liberated other forces and gave birth to new ideas, which have cooperated with them in advancing the progress of the race. But no one who goes to the bottom of what is distinctive of our modern civilization will deny that the ideas I have named are the basis on which our modern civilization rests, and will as little deny that, however self-evident some of them may now seem to us, it was Christianity which practically put the world in possession of them, and still sustains them in men's minds as living convictions. These ideas are now in large part, as I say, the common possession of mankind. They exist and operate far beyond the limits of the visible church. They have been taken up and contended for by men outside the church, unbelievers even, when the church itself had become unfaithful to them. But nonetheless are they of Christian parentage. They are the principles of the Bible, of the gospel. They lie at the basis of our modern assertion of equal rights, of rights of conscience, of justice to the individual in social and state arrangements, of the desire for brotherhood and peace, and amity among classes and nations. It is the Christian leaven that is fermenting, sometimes in turbid enough forms, in all this social seething we see going on around us. Christian ideas which are propelling the race on in its march of progress. Christian love, which is sustaining the best and purest and most self-sacrificing efforts to raise the fallen, rescue the drunkard, and make the condition of the race happier and better. And if the Christian root of these ideas and efforts were withdrawn, it would soon be seen how many of them would come to be laughed at as baseless ideals, and a very different range of ideas and motives would take their place. How, in their race for riches, lust for pleasure, and greed of power, men would be willing to trample the poor and helpless under their feet, if only they could by that means raise themselves a little higher. We thus see that even in a temporal respect, the Bible and its teachings are the grand civilizing agency of the world. The experience of the past proves it. Christian missions, with their benign effects in the spread of education, the checking of social evils and barbarities, the creation of trade and industry, the change in the status of women, the advance in the social and civilized life generally, prove it. We are still far enough from the goal, God knows. But contrast ancient pagan with modern society, with all its faults, and mark how far we have already traveled. Contrast Christian nations with nations yet in the night of heathenism, even with such lands as India and China, and note the contrast in the life of today. Take the Christian nations themselves, and see how it is those that have drunk most deeply into the Spirit of Christ, who most revere His word, respect His day, and observe most purely His worship, that stand foremost in all the elements that constitute true progress, foremost in enlightenment, in wealth, in virtue, in social order and happiness. Take finally the godly and godless classes in the same society, and mark how the tone of our public life and the stability of our institutions are strengthened by the former and are daily put in jeopardy by the latter. Quote, "The fear of the Lord is to hate evil," unquote. Proverbs 8, verse 13. And in proportion as that fear spreads itself through a community, the community will be stable, progressive, prosperous. Given a Bible-reading, Bible-loving people, and it will not be long before such a people is found well-housed, well-clothed, industrious, and content, before the demons of drink and poverty disappear from its midst, before schools and colleges spring up to educate its children, before all the tokens of a genuine prosperity are visible within its borders. Part 5. Thus far I have been speaking of the temporal advantages accruing from the religion of the Bible. But the chief blessing of the possession of the Bible is not told till we speak of what the world owes to it in a religious respect, and in regard to its eternal hopes. The two things are connected, for the moral reforms wrought by Christianity can never be dissociated from its religious ideas. Nothing elevates the mind or raises the affections so much as right thoughts of God. In the light of his relation to God, man attains to the sense of his dignity and worth as a moral being, and feels that life has an end which makes it worth living. The chief gain of the Bible, therefore, is still untold when we speak only of its literary and moral and civilizing effects. It is not disclosed till we think of its message of the love of God, and that light of eternal hope which streams from it into a world which, despite all speculations of reason and brilliance of civilization, would be hopelessly dark as respects the future without it. It is the Bible which gives the knowledge of God. I need not do more than lift a corner of the veil which at this distance of time hides from us the condition of the ancient world in a religious respect. What a spectacle of ignorance of the true God and of the way of life it is which presents itself! In one place it is the sun, moon, and planets which are the objects of worship. Elsewhere, as in Egypt, temples are built to four-footed beasts and creeping things of the earth. Compare Romans 1, verse 23. In other places, as in India, the great natural objects, the sky, the dawn, the rain, the rivers, fire, etc., are the favorite deities. In Greece, men adore gods sculptured in forms of human beauty. In Rome, gods of all countries are swept together, and worship is paid to them. Round the roots of these religions clung innumerable superstitions. The rites of many of them were licentious and revolting, in the service of gods of lust and gods of wine. The most shameful orgies were enacted. Where, from the list of these heathen gods, or in the stories told of them, could men get one idea to elevate them, one impulse to raise them above themselves to nobler life? When Plato sketched an ideal republic, his first concern was to banish the myths of the gods out of it. Think of our own island at the time when the light of Christianity first broke upon it. Druid priests chant their mysterious songs, go through their mystic ceremonies in dim forest recesses, plunge the sacrificial knife into shrieking human victims. The tribes who supplant them bring over their wild Scandinavian traditions, sing the praises of Thor and Odin, revel in the prospect of a Valhalla, where they will drink blood from the skulls of their slain enemies. Look at the lands which lie even yet in the shadow of death of heathenism. See their lords many and their gods many, their cruel practices, their revolting superstitions. As every student of social progress knows, their false religions rest on these lands with the weight of an incubus, and there can be no real progress till this incubus is shaken off. It is the poet Milton who, in his great ode on the Nativity, has described the dire consternation in the ranks of the heathen deities at the announcement of the birth of Christ. Christ came, and as his religion spread, the vapors of a dense heathen superstition rolled away before it, and gave place to a purer faith and to a nobler worship. Corruption, as we know, early seized on Christianity also, and in the course of centuries attained huge proportions. But we know, too, how, from time to time, as at the Reformation, through the force of that vitality within it, which is but another name for the abiding presence of God's Spirit in its midst, Christianity has risen up and thrown the worst of these corruptions off, and come forth stronger and purer than before. It is the Bible which in every case has been the instrument of God's Spirit in these reformations. It is the same Bible which has been the agency in that long series of historical revivals by which the Church has once and again been saved in days of stagnation and unbelief. Without the Bible, not one of these great changes would have been brought about. And how marvelous the results! To the gospel of Christ we owe it that we ourselves are not today worshipping stocks and stones, but are bowing in acknowledgment of the one God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is above all and in all. It was Christianity that in the early centuries overthrew the reign of the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome, and swept them so entirely from faith and history that no one now so much as dreams of the possibility of the revival of their worship. It was Christianity that, still retaining something of its youthful energy, laid hold of the rough barbarian peoples that overran Europe, and with the Bible's aid trained and molded them to some kind of civilization and moral life. It was Christianity that, in Scotland, lighted a light in the monasteries of Iona and other places, that by and by spread its beams through every part of the country. Just as today it is Christianity that is teaching the idolaters to burn their idols, to cease their horrid practices, to worship the true God, and take upon them the obligations of decent and civilized existence. As it is with the knowledge of God, so it is with hope for the future. The ancient world was as much in the darkness about a future life as it was about the being and character of God, and what notions it had were perplexed, confused, and erroneous in the extreme. But Christ, as he came from God and went to God, has shed a new light into the depths of the unseen, and by his own resurrection has opened the gates of a new and assured hope to mankind. 1 Peter 1, verse 3. The lesson of all history is that apart from the Bible and this hope which it contains, the world but gropes in darkness and wanders into deeper and ever deeper uncertainty, from the skepticism in which ancient Rome and Greece ended to the unconcealed agnosticism, and deeper than agnosticism, the pessimism under the depressing influence of which our modern age groans. Take a single illustration. I took up lately a work of fiction, a book written, its lately deceased author tells us, quote, for the first time in my life, wholly and solely to satisfy my own taste and my own conscience, unquote. And this is the kind of teaching it offers. The author is speaking in his own name. Blank pessimism, he says, is the one creed possible for all save fools. To hold any other is to curl yourself up selfishly in your own easy chair and say to your soul, O soul, eat and drink. O soul, make merry. Pessimism is sympathy. Optimism is selfishness. All honest art is therefore of necessity pessimistic, unquote. The close of the book describes the suicide of the heroine, and its last words are, quote, "Her stainless soul ceased to exist forever," unquote. In such an eclipse of hope, and there is more of that eclipse at this hour in human minds and hearts than one sometimes realizes, what can bring light to the world but the glorious message of life and immortality through the gospel of Jesus Christ? Look once more at heathenism. Here is an extract from a letter recently received from a young missionary working in India. Quote, "I have had to give up the idea," he says, "of sending home impressions of heathenism. Much of it is literally indescribable, and a good deal of it too awful to describe. It does not enter into one's mind all at once that one's whole environment in a place like this is almost incredibly vile. Things have not so appealing an appearance on the surface, but here and there are breaks, and one gets a glimpse inside," unquote. Then follows a counter-picture of the changes seen in the boys at his institution. Quote, "Here is a very primitive Christianity, if you like, but for pluck, frank good nature, real affection, and honest, downright fidelity, according to their lights, as widely different from heathen boys as night from day," unquote. It is this gospel which today is flooding with hope and courage myriads of hearts that would otherwise be in deepest despondency. That in India, in China, in Africa, in the New Hebrides, in every land to which it comes, in rising like a great rose of dawn, a, quote, "dayspring from on high," unquote, fraught with hope and healing for the woes of men. But in this great work of the recovery of mankind to God, of the regeneration of the world, how absolutely indispensable is the Bible. Without it, what could the missionary, arm and tongue paralyzed, accomplish? With it, even in the absence of the missionary, what wondrous changes, moral miracles even, are sometimes effected. Like seeds wafted by the wind into the crevices of hard rock that grow and flourish, and by split the rock, the simple truths of the Bible, without a human tongue to expound and enforce them, have often taken root and brought forth amazing fruit to God's sole glory. It was through a copy of the New Testament, found floating in the waters of the Bay of Yedo, that the gospel re-entered Japan and created the first band of disciples, the nucleus of the future church, when as yet no Christian teacher was permitted to enter, and the profession of Christianity was prohibited on pain of death. Need I, finally, in this plea for the power of the Bible, go further than its blessed results to ourselves? What do we not owe to the Bible and to the gospel which it brings? I have spoken already of civil blessings. I look now only to the spiritual. Our innumerable churches, our Sabbath rest and privileges, the religion whose power inspires so much earnest life and so much noble work, the blessed effects of that religion in peace, in strength, in moral impulse in the minds that possess it, the comfort it dispenses in trial, and the joy and triumph it gives in death. All this is the fruit of the message of the Bible. Whatever blessings or hopes we can trace to our Christian faith, whatever light it imparts to our minds or cheer to our hearts, whatever power there is in it to sustain holiness or conquer sin, all this we owe to the fact that Jesus came and lived and died and rose again and has given us of his Spirit, and that we have the Bible in our hands to tell us that he did it and what he expects us to be and do as his disciples. Here I close these papers. Surveying the whole road we have traveled, am I not entitled to claim that the rock of God's truth stands fast, and that Jesus, his gospel, and the book that sets forth both are still, let men gainsay as they will, the spiritual powers that hold in them the hope of the world's future? Christ's reign is not ending. It will endure. In many ways, voluntary or involuntary, his supremacy is owned by the very persons who most loudly dispute his claims. In Browning's poem, Christmas Eve, we are introduced to a German professor who, after having in the usual way resolved the life of Jesus into myth, suddenly changes his tone completely. Quote, "Admire we," the poet says, "how, quote, when the critic had done his best, and the pearl of price at reason's test lay dust and ashes levigable on the professor's lecture table, when we looked for the inference and monition that our faith reduced to such condition, be swept forthwith to its natural dust-hole, he bids us, when we least expect it, take back our faith, if it be not just whole. Go home and venerate the myth I thus have experimented with. This man continue to adore him, rather than all who went before him, and all who ever followed after." Unquote. Thus, paradoxically, does even unbelief confirm the Scripture statement that God has given Jesus, quote, "the name which is above every name," unquote. Philippians 2, verse 9. Christ's own church, with more consistency, echoes the confession. But so long as Christ, in his self-attesting power, commands the allegiance of believing hearts, the Bible, which contains the priceless treasure of God's Word regarding him, will remain in undimmed honor. It will be read, prized, and studied by devout minds while the world lasts. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Bible Under Trial. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ron Altman. The Bible Under Trial by James Orr. Appendix. Professor G.A. Smith on Recent Developments of Old Testament Criticism. A striking corroboration of the statement that the shaking in Old Testament criticism is not all in one direction is furnished by the able article on Recent Developments of Old Testament Criticism in the January number of the Quarterly Review from the pen of Dr. G.A. Smith, 18 or 20 years ago, Dr. Smith says, everything was thought to be tolerably well settled. Now, apparently, it is mostly all unsettled again, except as to the main facts of the analysis, and perhaps the exilic date of the priestly law, the latter, a view which seems to be, to the present writer, demonstrably untenable. With 3/4 of the article, one can express hearty agreement. The criticism of Dr. Shane, who, quote, stalks through the Negev and northern Arabia, sowing forests on the hills, and lifting kingdoms from the sand, unquote, of the new textual criticism of the poetical and prophetical books, quote, through which it drives like a great plowshare, turning up the whole surface and menacing not only the minor landmarks, but, in the case of the prophets, the main outlines of the field as well, unquote. And of the new and revolutionary Babylonian school of Winkler is trenchant and successful. It is a large admission when the writer allows that Wellhausen and Professor Robertson Smith were wrong about the dates of the patriarchal narratives, and signifies his adhesion to Gunkel in carrying back these narratives to 1200 B.C. Gunkel may still regard the narratives as legendary, though he, quote, has shown that we must read in them the style, the ideas, and the historical conditions of the ages before Moses, unquote. But we are certain that if Dr. Smith applied his pen to the task, he could as effectively dispose of Gunkel's fantastic theory of the origin of the legends as he has done in the case of Winkler's hypothesis that the prophets were the kept agents of foreign powers. Stories such as we have about the patriarchs, with their depth of meaning and penetration with promise and purpose, are not the kind of thing that legend produces. Larger results follow from the range of these admissions than appear in the article. If the patriarchal narratives existed in 1200 B.C., who will certify that they may not have existed much earlier? If they existed then, why could they not be written then? The article has little to say on the recent discoveries on the early development of writing. The chief reasons for the ordinary dating of J and E fall to the ground if the narratives, as Gunkel thinks, have no mirroring of events after 900. Or again, if the narratives go back to 1200, how far are we supposed to be from the Exodus? If the Ramesses II theory of the oppression is maintained, the Exodus will fall, in the opinion of recent scholars, not earlier than about 1230 or 1250. Dr. Smith may put it a little sooner. In any case, on this view, 1200 B.C. takes us back so nearly to the Mosaic age that the difference hardly seems worth fighting for. In the article, some friendly criticisms are offered on the present writer's volume on the Old Testament, and certain objections are mentioned to the early date of the Deuteronomic and Levitical legislation there maintained, which are thought to be insuperable. A word may be said on these in concluding. They may not leave the same impression of insuperableness on other minds. The objections specified are 3 in all. 1. That Elijah repaired and sacrificed at the altars of Jehovah, this in disproof of the existence of the law of a central altar, Deuteronomy 12. But one may well ask, what was Elijah to do after the complete suspension of political and religious relations between the northern and southern kingdoms, which ensued almost immediately after the house of Jehovah had been built? What could he do, or would he be likely to do, but just what is narrated, fall back on the simpler forms of worship that previously had prevailed. The repairing of the altars of Jehovah does not show, at least, much sympathy with the calf worship, the flocking to the shrines of which was probably the cause of neglect of the altars. 2. That Jeremiah states, chapter 12, verse 22, that Jehovah gave no commands to Israel concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. This in proof that if the Levitical laws were extant in Jeremiah's time, he was ignorant of them. But this surely is a large and impossible inference from a passage that can quite easily be understood in a less absolute way. It involves the view that Jeremiah did not know or accept Deuteronomy in a form which included chapter 12. Quoting, "all that I command you," unquote, verse 11. It overlooks that it is not the Levitical laws only that command and regulate sacrifice. Surely Jeremiah knew the Book of the Covenant. Compare Exodus 20, verse 24, and 23, verse 18. And was not ignorant of the sacrifices at the making of the covenant. Compare Exodus 24, verse 5 to 8. And it is contradicted by the fact that Jeremiah, like other prophets, himself pictures sacrifices and offerings as part of the order of the perfected theocracy. Chapter 27, verse 26. Compare 33, verses 17 and 18. In any case, is it not true, according to the Pentateuch itself, that when God brought the people out of Egypt and made his covenant with them, the stress was laid primarily on moral obedience? Exodus 19, verse 5, Exodus 20, and 24, verse 7. And that the Levitical sacrifices had a secondary place. 3. A special disproof of the existence of the Levitical law is found in the narrative of the sins of Eli's sons in 1 Samuel 2. Quote, "The demand of these sons of Belial, as the narrative calls them, to have the flesh given to them raw, is the very thing that Leviticus enjoins," unquote. But is this criticism cogent? First, the rendering probably needs to be amended. Instead of, quote, "and the custom of the priests with the people was that," unquote, etc., verse 13, the rendering of the Revised Version margin, quote, "they knew not the Lord nor the due," that's right, "of the priests from the people," unquote, has the balance of scholarly opinion in its favor. It is the rendering adopted or preferred by Wellhausen, Nowak, Klosterman, Van Hoonacker, H.P. Smith, Driver, etc. Then the practice of the sons of Eli in taking their portion of the sacrifice with a hook out of the pot in which it was boiling falls into its place as an abuse. When contradiction is found in their demand to have their portion given to them raw, which was the thing the law contemplated, the accent is laid in the wrong place. The quarrel of the people with the priests was that the priests refused to burn the fat on the altar before claiming or seizing their portion. They seem to have been willing to give the priests their portion in any form desired. Why should they not? Provided the fat was first burned. Verse 16. The sons of Belial refused and helped themselves by violence when the flesh was being cooked. So far from contradicting the Levitical law, the passage testifies, 1, to a right or due of the priests from the people, 2, to the fact that portions were assigned them from the sacrifices, and 3, to a law requiring them to burn the fat before doing anything else. There was certainly no Levitical law entitling them to neglect or postpone the burning of the fat. It looks as if the existence of the ritual laws, instead of being overthrown, was very clearly established. End of section 25. End of The Bible Under Trial by James Orr.